Considering the reputation the Great Northern Forest had among people living in more southern, civilized territories, one would expect the place to be a giant death trap, with every animal and a good portion of the plants trying to kill you at every turn. The truth, Zorian had found, was a little more complex. While yes, the forest was full of dangerous creatures, even the deer were kind of aggressive and had tried to gore him a couple of times instead of fleeing from his approach. It was entirely possible to spend an entire day without endangering your life if you knew what you were doing. Granted, Zorian had a somewhat unfair advantage in the form of his mind sense, which let him sense a lot of the dangers before they had the chance to detect him in turn. Furthermore, the region he was frequenting was a border area, thus a little friendlier to humans than the deep, untouched wilderness in the far north. Still, he was confident that even a skilled civilian could move through the forest unmolested, much less a mage. Hell, he was doing just fine at the moment, despite having less than a month of experience. Usually, Zorian wouldn't have wanted to move through the forest undetected. The whole point of going here was to get combat experience, so avoiding danger was kind of missing the point. This time, however, sneaking around was more or less mandatory. He really didn't want to get distracted around a threat on the level of a grey hunter, and he definitely didn't want to alert the monster that he was coming by engaging in a loud, flashy fight right next to its lair. He slowly circled the area around the grey hunter's lair, checking it for threats and hostile terrain that might inhibit him should he choose to retreat in any particular direction. In several places he carved clusters of explosive glyphs into the trees and exposed rocks. He doubted they were powerful enough to seriously hurt a grey hunter, but they might buy him a few seconds he needed to teleport away to safety. He almost succeeded in reaching the lair without a fight. Thankfully the trio of flymosquito whatever things that tried to ambush him were very easy to dispatch, they burned beautifully, and the fight didn't raise enough ruckus to attract the monstrous spider's attention. Zorian picked out a rather tall tree close, but not too close, to the grey hunter's lair and levitated himself to the upper branches, where he promptly took out the binoculars he enchanted earlier for the purpose and started studying his target. The location was actually kind of picturesque, a small rocky gully surrounded by forest, with some pretty sediment lines crisscrossing the stone and a few strategically placed clumps of grass growing between the cracks. On one of the walls stood a perfectly circular hole that served as the entrance to the cave. It was pitch black and surprisingly unremarkable and unthreatening. If Silver Lake hadn't told him it was there, it was entirely possible that Zorian would have missed it entirely if he had ever stumbled into the place in one of the restarts. It would have been the last mistake he ever made, at least in that hypothetical restart. Grey hunters were crazy good jumpers and possessed downright surreal speed. Zorian would bet anything that the one inside that cave could jump straight from the cave entrance to the other side of the gully in a single leap and close in before Zorian could so much as realize what was happening. The grey hunter was fundamentally a very simple monster. It was a grey, furry spider the size of an adult man, and it also happened to be incredibly fast, strong, durable and spell-resistant. It could run faster than a hasted mage, jump incredible distances, shrug off regular firearms and lower-level attack spells like a duck shrugging off water, outright ignore most direct effect spells and bite through steel. Oh, and it had a very nasty poison that, instead of destroying tissue or wrecking the nervous system like most poisons, utterly disrupted a mage's ability to shape and control their mana instead. Once bitten, you wouldn't be casting anything for a while, and it would take weeks for the poison to fully flush out of your system. Apparently it was a type of poison adapted specifically to bring down magical beings that were the grey hunter's typical prey, but it was just as effective against human mages. Basically, if you were fighting against a grey hunter alone and got bitten, you were done for. These things were known for chewing through entire groups of battle mages sent specifically to get rid of them. Quite a feat for what is ostensibly an animal-level creature. Most non-sapient monsters, no matter how impressive, were too easy to lure into traps to pose such a huge danger to a prepared hunting group. Naturally, Silver Lake wanted him to tangle with said mage-killing super spider as her price for her help. The good news was that she hadn't asked him to kill the thing, something that Zorian suspected might be beyond him at the moment. The bad news was that her request was only a smidgen easier than that. She wanted him to confront the female grey hunter who laired in the cave he was currently observing and steal some of her eggs. The life cycle of grey hunters was a total mystery, as they were considered too dangerous to study through anything other than post-battle reports and vivisection, but Zorian was willing to bet that grey hunter mothers were fiercely protective of their spawn. Getting even a single egg was likely to be quite a challenge. In all likelihood, the mother would be reluctant to go far from her egg sac for any reason, so waiting for the chance to simply swipe some may be impractical, or even futile. For all he knew, the female sat on her egg sac all day long and lived off her fat reserves until the young hatched. Zorian placed the binoculars back into his bag and started jotting down notes in one of the notebooks he brought with him. The question of how to acquire the eggs without getting horribly murdered in the process was ultimately a question for another time. He was currently here just to scout out the situation and see if the task was even possible. As much as he wanted to prove the shriveled old witch wrong by completing her impossible quest, dying here would be incredibly stupid. He was on a time limit. A long time limit, but repeatedly dying because he decided to take on opponents way over his level would be an unforgivable waste. Every restart cut short was a restart he wasn't using to its full potential. If he couldn't think of a way to get the eggs that he was absolutely sure would work, he wouldn't do it. And even if he could think of a way, he would only try it out near the end of the restart, when the most he would lose was a couple of days. "All right," he mumbled, snapping the notebook shut. "Let's see what I'm dealing with." The first thing he did was try to locate the grey hunter female to make sure she wasn't outside her lair at the moment. He had no way of tracking down grey hunters specifically through divination, as he had never seen one before and lacked any grey hunter body parts. But a simple locator spell searching for a giant spider pointed him straight at the cave. Since the other two giant spider varieties that lived in the region, giant tree spider and giant trapdoor spider respectively, didn't live in caves, the conclusion was obvious. He then tried to scry the spider, which immediately failed. Well, the spell technically worked, but the cave was totally dark. There were no glowing crystals or ember moss that occasionally lit natural caverns, just an ordinary cave full of impenetrable darkness that hid everything. Damn! He hadn't thought of that. Racking his brains for a spell combination that would allow him to scout out the lair without having to go back into the city and hit the books, he decided to combine two different spells. First he cast the Arcanite spell, creating a floating ectoplasmic eyeball through which he could see remotely. He then created a floating ball of light, functionally identical to the simple, floating lantern spell, except he altered the spell parameters so it would follow the ectoplasmic eye around instead of himself. He then sent the eye into the cave, closing his real eyes and connecting his sight to his remote sensor. There was a chance that the light would aggravate the grey hunter mother, but he doubted she would run out to confront him just for that, or that she could track him down on his tree for that matter. As it happened, the grey hunter was either very bothered by his floating lantern or perhaps saw it as prey, because the eye had barely advanced into the cave, floating lantern in tow, when a grey blur slammed into it and Zorian's awareness was violently wrenched back into his body. Blinking in surprise at his sudden perspective shift, Zorian was then treated to the sight of the grey hunter leaping out of the cave and skittering around the area in search of something. After 10 seconds or so of looking at the spider, Zorian noticed two things. First, the grey hunter female didn't have to sit on her egg sac all day long, because she was freaking carrying it on the underside of her abdomen. That was so freaking unfair. He withdrew everything he said about Silver Lake's task being easier than killing the thing. This was actually way harder, since he was only getting the eggs by taking them from the grey hunter's cooling corpse, but had to be careful when killing her not to damage the, likely much frilier, egg sac. The second thing he noticed was that the spider was steadily getting closer to his location. It wasn't immediately noticeable. Rather than immediately making a beeline towards him, the spider shot off in a random direction for a second, stopped for a moment, as if reorienting herself, and then shot off in a seemingly random direction. Again. It repeated the same Stopanskitter routine second after second. And though the movement seemed random at first, Zorian noted with dread that it was steadily getting closer to his tree as time passed. So the murder spider also had hypersensitive senses. Now. This was such bullshit. How the hell had it noticed him anyway? He'd even taken the time to set up some camouflage spells and silencing wards around himself just to prevent stuff like this from happening. True. They were fairly weak. In order to conserve mana. But that shouldn't have. He frowned. That was it. Wasn't it? The Grey Hunter was tracking him through the wards. Its natural prey was said to be other magical creatures. It had a poison specifically designed to counter magic. It probably had some kind of innate magic sense that let it sense its prey over great distances. Rather than shielding him from the Grey Hunter, the wards he set up were revealing his location to it. The fact they were so weak was probably the only reason it hadn't divined his location instantly and was instead reduced to stumbling all over the place in an attempt to locate him. If so, he was in trouble. He couldn't do nothing, as the monster would eventually sniff him out. On the other hand, the moment he tried to teleport away, his location would almost certainly be completely blown. 10 seconds later, with the spider getting ever closer and no solution in sight, Zorian decided he would just have to work fast and pray for the best. Taking a deep breath to calm himself down, he started casting the teleport spell as fast as he could. As he feared, the Grey Hunter reacted instantly. The moment the first word of the chant left his mouth, the spider surged towards him, abandoning its previous jerky, uncertain advance. As it sprinted towards him, it angled away from the explosive glyph cluster Zorian placed on one of the rocks in its path, somehow aware of its existence and function, and launched itself sideways into the air. It landed vertically on the trunk of a nearby tree and immediately launched itself sideways again, bouncing from tree to tree and gaining altitude with each jump, until at last it was both close and high enough to reach Zorian's location. Zorian finished the teleport spell and was whisked away in the nick of time. The terrifying vision of a giant spider sailing through the air towards him, front legs extended and huge black fangs poised for a strike, would haunt his nightmares for days to come. Following his almost lethal encounter with the Grey Hunter, Zorian decided to put Silver Lake's quest on indefinite hold. There were plenty of other people that Kale listed as possible help. After all. And maybe if he talked to her in some other restart and tried again, she'd send him on a less suicidal quest. It was very frustrating, though. The thought of how thoroughly he had been outclassed by what was fundamentally a dumb beast brought to mind the memory of that final restart in Scioria when he clashed with Red Robe in the ruins of the Iranian settlement. The fact that the Grey Hunter was a giant spider, just like the Urania, further brought to mind uncomfortable parallels. Despite the fact that he knew intellectually that there was no shame in losing to a creature that even famous mages would balk at facing, and that he should in fact be happy to even be alive, he found himself very bothered at his ineffectiveness. He spent the next day by tracking down giant trapdoor spiders, which were of similar size to Grey Hunters but brown-colored and a hell of a lot less dangerous, before smoking them out of their holes and then killing them in a variety of painful fashions. Their eyes and venom glands sold a lot better than winter wolf pelts. 2. He should do that more often. Still somewhat in a foul mood, he set out to see if any of Kale's other contacts were able and willing to help him. When he arrived in the village where his first candidate lived and was informed by the locals that the man hadn't been seen in the past 2 months, he was unconcerned. The man was a retired mage fascinated with familiars. He had 6 of them as well as a great number of more mundane pets, and was always looking to add another exotic creature to his menagerie. An absence of 2 months was a bit unusual. But not something to immediately raise an alarm about. But then other disappearances started piling up. The old herbalist lady that also sometimes removed curses was simply gone. And her neighbors had no idea where she went. The two brothers that lived in a tower they built away from civilization and secretly studied soul magic were not present at their home. The gate to their tower broken and the inside stripped bare of anything worthwhile. The priest in the nearby town dedicated to studying the undead and ways to fight them had been found dead in his home 4 days ago. Cause of death unknown. He was young and had no known medical problems or addictions. So foul play was suspected. An alchemist specializing in transformation magic was torn apart outside his village by a pack of unusually aggressive boars. And so on. Only the priest and the alchemist were actually confirmed dead. The others having gone on sudden business trips or just plain gone missing one day. And the disappearances were in a sufficiently large area that no one seemed to have connected them in a single pattern. But Zorian knew this was not accidental. Someone was deliberately targeting anyone who had some sort of knowledge on soul magic. The only question was whether the missing people were dead or just kidnapped for some purpose. Thankfully, he finally managed to locate one of the people Kale mentioned to him. Unfortunately, the man in question didn't actually know any soul magic. Vani was just a scholar. And according to Kale could probably point him towards someone who does. Probably. The only trick was that Vani liked to talk. Meandering from topic to topic as he pleased. And he would refuse to help anyone who was in any way impolite with him. Thus, anyone seeking him out for advice had to be very patient and ready for frequent aggressions. Zorian could do patient. He knocked on the door to the man's home and was promptly ushered inside by Vani. A cheerful older man with a receding hairline who was not at all surprised that someone sought him out for advice. The inside was packed. That was the only word that fit. Really. Almost every inch of the house was filled with boxes. Shelves and pedestals that held books. Statues big and small. Plants and animals preserved in bottles. Glass cases that held tiny models or buildings and other such things. Where the walls were visible, they were usually filled with paintings and drawings. As Vani led them both into his study, Zorian's view fell on a particularly large and lifelike statue of a naked woman with some rather bountiful assets, and he quirked an amused eyebrow at the man. "It's a air goddess of fertility sort of thing," the man hastened to explain. "Just a temporary thing. A friend of mine sent it to me for safekeeping, and you know how it goes. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, don't think I don't know who you are. Young man, you're the one who has been killing all the winter wolves in the region lately." "Air. Is that a problem?" Zorian asked. "Problem?" the man laughed. "Just the opposite. Finally someone did something to cull those awful beasts a little. They're not too bad right now. But come winter they get aggressive and start assaulting travelers and outlying communities. There's been a number of child disappearances the last few winters. And everyone knows it's probably the winter wolves at fault. Damn things get bolder with every passing year. How come nobody organized a hunting party yet?" Then, asked Zorian. The Mage Guild was pretty much founded to respond to situations like this. After all, it snows pretty heavily here in winter. And whole towns can sometimes get cut off from the rest of the world for days. So it's hard to marshal a response in time. Most of the time no one even finds out there was a crisis until days afterwards. When nothing can be done, Vani tapped the table with his fingers contemplatively. As if considering something. Or at least, that's what the hunters and the authorities like to say. Personally, I just think they're afraid of the Silver One. "Silver One?" asked Zorian curiously. "It's a rumor. A few years back, When the winter wolves first started acting up, there was an attempt to organize a wide-scale cull and a large hunting party was organized. It ended poorly. According to stories, several winter wolf packs worked together to lure the hunters into traps, separating them into smaller groups that were then defeated in detail. They acted more like an army than a group of wild animals. And survivors claimed they were led by a huge winter wolf with a shiny silver pelt. The silver one, an alpha of alphas. As smart as any man and with the power to direct his lesser brothers against humans. There was an official attempt by the Eldamar's Mage Guild to locate and eliminate this winter wolf. But they found nothing in either the silver wolf nor any evidence of multiple packs working together. A lot of the locals are still convinced he exists, though they say that anyone who goes after the wolves ends up getting confronted by it sooner or later. I see, frowned Zorian. And what do you think? It's possible. I suppose, admitted Vani. We live in a crazy world. And you can never really say that something is impossible. It could be a runaway experiment made by some crazy mage in the forest. It could be a new species originating from the heart of winter. It could even be a polymorphed mage on some deranged crusade to protect the bloodthirsty monsters from those terrible humans. All I know is that I'm glad someone is not getting intimidated by all the scaremongering floating around. It took another 15 minutes till Vani decided to even ask what Zorian came to him for. Kale sent me, Zorian said. Or rather, he listed your name as a possible source of advice. Kale. Vani said happily. Oh. I remember him shame about what happened to his wife and mother-in-law. The weeping took so many great people from us. He still has his daughter. Though. Doesn't he? Zorian nodded. Good. Children are the greatest treasure. Tell him I said that. He helped me write a book. You know. Did he tell you that? He did, Zorian confirmed. Kale had warned him that Vani was a little vain and loved discussing his books. And that it might be a good idea to read one or two. Zorian took this advice and read 2 of them. The first one. The one that Kale had helped the man write by gathering the accounts of various people in the region. Was about the recent history of the region and was mostly a collection of anecdotes. Some interesting and amusing and some of them mind-numbingly boring. If it weren't for Kale's advice, he never would have gone past the first chapter. I even read it. As well as one other book. Oh. It was titled, History of Pre-Icosian Altazia, Zorian said. Considering whether to tell the man the truth or to simply flatter him, he decided to go with the truth for now. It was kind of interesting. But I don't really agree with the lot of it. My principal complaint is that you keep talking about pre-Icosian tribes living on Altazia as if they had lived in total vacuum. When the reality was that the entire southern coast of Altazia was dotted with Icosian colonies and forts stretching back for at least 1,000 years. Icosians were hardly the total aliens to Altazia that you portray them as in your work. But the historical evidence clearly shows that the cultural influence of those coastal states didn't extend very far inland, pointed out Vani triumphantly. That may be strictly true. But Icosians were vastly more technologically advanced than Altazian tribes in most areas. And I think you're greatly underestimating the effect of simple technological diffusion on people's culture. Yeah. This was probably going to take a while. Thank you for that, Vani said. They had been talking for several hours at that point. And Vani seemed surprisingly pleased to have met someone who disagreed with his conclusions and was willing to talk about it. Zorian also found out that the man was incredibly well read and seemed to have memorized half a dozen encyclopedias. Because he was a font of various trivia. Whatever he thought about the man's conclusions, he clearly hadn't arrived on them on a whim. It's been a while since I had this kind of discussion with someone. Usually the kind of people willing to talk to me don't know enough to challenge me. And the ones that do know enough aren't interested in talking. You flatter me. I don't really think my opinions have the same weight as yours. I certainly haven't done even 1/100th of the research you did, Zorian said. Never hurt to butter people up a little. But I really shouldn't waste your time for much longer. I came to you because I wanted your advice on how to find an expert in soul magic. Soul magic? The man asked with a frown. It's a personal issue that I'd rather not talk about, Zorian said. Suffice to say, I have been hit by a soul magic spell of unknown effects and want to talk to someone about finding out what exactly has been done to me and how to protect myself against any further such events. Vani hummed. And Kale sent you to me? You were on the list of people he said could help me. However, you were the only one I could actually locate. The others were well. It's very disturbing. Let me tell you about my last couple of days. Vani listened to Zorian's description of disappearances with growing unease. Writing down the names and facts that Zorian uncovered on a piece of paper. That is indeed very disturbing, Vani agreed when Zorian was finished. To think that such a thing could happen without everyone realizing it for so long. I will bring this matter to the attention of proper authorities. Have no worry about that. It does make me wonder who I can recommend to you when so many of the obvious choices have become unavailable. Let me think about this a little. 5 minutes later. Vani managed to think up a solution. Tell me, he asked. What do you know about shifters? That they're people who have the ability to turn into animals. Zorian tried. Shifters are people with 2 souls, Vani said. Long in the past, the ancestors of the shifters enacted rituals that fused their souls with the souls of their chosen animals, allowing them to take the forms of the animals in question and even access some of the abilities of said animals in their human form. It is a very old form of magic that predates the Icosian invasion of Altazia. And I'm sad to say that most shifter tribes have lost the knowledge of the original rituals they used to create their kind. These days, they grow in numbers purely through mundane reproduction, with children of shifters inheriting their parents' dual soul. There exist, however, tribes that retain the knowledge of ritual magic and soul mechanics necessary to perform the ritual in the modern age. While the purpose of such expertise is to turn regular humans into new members of the tribe, it may very well be general enough to help you with your issue. I see. And where can I find these shifters? Zorian asked. That, Vani said, spreading his arms in a helpless gesture. I do not know. Shifter tribes have a checkered history with the, shall we say, civilized communities. They rarely want to be found. But I do know that there is a fairly powerful wolf shifter tribe living in this region, a tribe that definitely has the expertise you seek. I do not know who you need to talk to in order to meet with their leadership. But I do know that the leader of the tribe sent his daughter to Scioria to get an education in more modern forms of magic. Rainy is her name. I think. A redhead. Quite the looker. I'm told. Perhaps you can start there. Zorian blinked. Rainy is a wolf shifter. That wow. Yeah. Now that he thought about it, there were some things that could point that way. Well, said Zorian, rising from his seat. You gave me a lot to think about. Thank you for your time. Think nothing of it, Vani smiled. Go kill a few more winter wolves for me. Is all I ask for. Wouldn't a tribe of wolf shifters kind of dislike me for killing so many wolves? Zorian asked. They're wolf shifters. Not winter wolf shifters, Vani said. I'm pretty sure they don't like each other much. Winter wolves have a habit of killing their more mundane relatives and invading their territory. Zorian left after that, unsure how to proceed further in the restart. Back already? Silverlake asked him, not bothering to look up from her bundle of herbs while addressing him. I'm not seeing any egg sac on you. Though. That's because Spider Mommy is carrying her eggs on her underbelly, he said. The task is impossible. Why would you even send me on such a fool's errand? Kale said you were eccentric. But ultimately harmless. This isn't harmless. I almost died. Zorian opened his mouth and then closed it. Suddenly. Her logic sounded a lot more reasonable to him. She didn't know he was on a month-long time limit. After all. As far as she was concerned. Giving him a task that would take several months to complete was perfectly logical. Where was the hurry? As for the suicidal nature of the task she gave him, apparently she had more faith in his skills than he himself did. Did he really give up too soon? A few months is too late, he said. Anything that happens after the summer festival might as well not exist for me. Silver Lake finally stopped fiddling with the herb pile and gave him a hard look. Her eyes glowing brightly for a moment. You're not dying, she stated. Not out of sickness. Anyway. Someone hunting for you? Zorian hesitated. The image of Red Robe dancing before his eyes and opened his mouth to say yes. Silver Lake cut him off. Though. No. Not really, she stated. Going back to her herbs. You have an enemy. But then again, who doesn't? Zorian exhaled in irritation and rose up. Deciding to leave before he lost his cool and attacked her. He'd probably get stomped into the ground. Anyway. Just before he teleported away. Though. A thought struck him. To hell with it, he thought. Why not? Hypothetically speaking, he said. If you were visited by a time traveler who claimed to know your future self, what would you ask of him as proof? Hypothetically speaking, she said. Her mouth stretching into a cruel grin. I would have asked him to retrieve a Grey Hunter egg sac for me. Throwing his hands in the air in defeat. Zorian teleported back to his inn in Nyazov-Dveri. The cackling of a sadistic old woman echoing behind him. In the safety of the room he rented at the inn. Zorian was sitting on the bed. Dismantling a rifle he had bought earlier. It was kind of amusing how easy it was to procure a firearm compared to high-level combat magic aids. Despite them being just as lethal. But there you had it. They were especially easy to procure here in Nyazov-Dveri. Which was so close to the wilderness and its dangers. In any case. He was trying to see how the things worked and, more importantly, how they could be enchanted. Firearms were notoriously tricky to enhance with magic. Like all ranged weapons. They had the problem that you could only enchant the device to be more accurate and durable. And if you wanted the projectile to have any sort of magical effect upon striking the target, you had to enchant the projectile itself. Bullets were unfortunately very hard to enchant. Being much smaller than arrows and crossbow bolts and usually made from some very magically unsuitable materials. You also couldn't touch the bullet to channel mana into it once it was already in the gun, though maybe if he installed some crystal mana channels into the gun via alteration. While he studied the device in front of him, Zorian idly considered ways to off the Grey Hunter from earlier. He had no intention of actually trying any of them, as they were each more implausible than the last. But there was no harm in coming up with scenarios. Grey Hunters had known weaknesses. First of all, they were purely melee opponents if you could keep them at a distance. There was nothing they could do to you. The trouble was that they were really good at closing in on their target. Secondly, they were ultimately just magical animals, so they could be lured into prepared traps and kill zones fairly easily. The problem here was that they were fast and tough enough to probably survive such a blunder. The magic sense the Grey Hunter demonstrated in Zorian's first encounter with it probably also helped it avoid the most blatant of such traps. He could think of several ways to trap it. But most of them required knowledge of spells that he didn't have. If he knew how to make a simulacrum and open portals, he could simply send in his simulacrum as bait and then open a portal leading to wherever he set the trap up. Hell! Simply knowing how to make a simulacrum would make things a million times easier, since he could test his ideas without endangering himself. If he knew large terrain alteration spells, he could simply seal it off in its lair and wait for it to suffocate. If he knew the spells to manipulate large amounts of water, he might be able to drown it. And so on. And so on. He also considered poisoning the thing or putting it to sleep, or otherwise using some kind of alchemical concoction that would cripple or kill it, but anything potent enough to kill such a beast was heavily restricted. Made out of super rare ingredients and expensive as all hell. He didn't know how to make anything like that. And couldn't get his hands on something that valuable and forbidden through trade. He could try for brute force and build a golem to take the spider down. Since they were machines animated by magic, they were immune to poison and could be extremely strong enough to crush the stupid spider in a head-to-head fight. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to build a golem. Any golem at all. Let alone one good enough to go toe-a-toe with a grey hunter. The art of golem making was complicated enough that several houses were dedicated to mastering it. And not something to dabble in for a week or two. Or even a month or two. Furthermore, even if he knew how to build it, the process of building would take at least a week and probably more. Require a specialized workshop and consume a lot of expensive materials. He would likely bankrupt himself before he was even halfway finished. Which brought him to firearms. The revolver worked well enough against Red Robe when his spells had failed him. After all, no regular firearm would do against the Grey Hunter. Though he needed something stronger than that. Unfortunately, higher calibers were usually reserved for the military, and he would need to raid a military base and steal one if he wanted to go down that route. That could end very badly. Who knew what kind of defenses a military base had? And being captured and interrogated by military investigators while drugged out of his mind on various truth serums was almost as bad as being discovered by a hostile mind mage or a necromancer. Plus, he was pretty sure they had a couple of mind mages and necromancers on the payroll anyway. Oh. And even if he did find something suitable under a lax enough security, there was the matter that it would almost certainly still have to be enchanted, and he couldn't even figure out how to effectively enchant a simple rifle at the moment. Probably wouldn't by the end of the restart. Either. A knock on his door woke him up from his musings, and he quickly put the rifle into its box and hid it under the bed. Him owning the rifle wasn't illegal. But he'd still rather not let whomever was looking for him see him tinkering with it. He made sure his shielding bracelet was on. Just in case. And then opened the door. It was Guri. Which did not surprise Zorian all that much. The man had been dutifully buying off any of the various alchemical ingredients and assorted body parts Zorian had gathered in the forest, and allowed Zorian to use his workshop when he needed to make some of the trickier potions and magic items. The man had already commissioned a couple of magic items from Zorian. So he expected Guri's arrival to be about another commission. As it turned out, Guri had another kind of deal in mind. Once the pleasantries were exchanged, he skipped straight to the point. I want you to help me rob my rival. I want you to help me rob my rival. Zorian blinked in surprise before giving the man an incredulous look. What? And why the hell would I do that? He asked the man curiously. Guri grinned triumphantly. I knew I was right about you, he said. You didn't even pretend to be outraged at the question. Zorian frowned. I'm just not a very excitable person. That's all. It doesn't mean I'm going to actually help you rob someone, he shot back crankily. In fact, I can scarcely imagine a situation where I would agree to such a thing. I was just curious what possessed you to broach the topic at all. This isn't some kind of attempt at blackmail. Is it? Oh no. I'd have to be pretty stupid to try and blackmail a man who hunts winter wolves and giant trapdoor spiders for a living, Guri assured him quickly. Not that I have anything worthwhile to blackmail you with. Anyway. No. I just felt I had an interesting deal for you and that I had nothing to lose by making an offer. You don't seem like the sort that would get all high and mighty on me just because I employ a few shady business practices. I figure the worst you do is say no. Zorian was silent for a moment. He supposed that Guri had him there even if Zorian actually cared to turn Guri in. It would still be his word against Guri's. Proving the man's guilt would be a hassle. Guri would likely get a mere slap on the wrist even if convicted. And it would lead to far greater scrutiny of Zorian's activities by nearby powers than he was comfortable with. All in all, it would mean an entire restart wasted on a pointless crusade that had no meaning inside the time loop and would quite possibly attract the attention of the Academy authorities. Previous restarts had made it clear they were very quick to involve themselves when one of their students had a brush with the law or the police. And he was still technically enrolled there. And if the Academy found out about his whereabouts and activities, it was entirely possible Red Robe would also find out about it through cephalic rats or his other spies. No. Even if Guri was planning to murder someone, Zorian would not intervene. A simple theft, well. He wasn't sure he would actually care all that much even if he wasn't stuck in the time loop, and he certainly didn't care at all now. Well. The answer is definitely no, said Zorian finally. I know that wanderers like me have a reputation of being opportunistic. But I'm afraid my ethics aren't quite as flexible as that. I'm not going to stoop to banditry or burglary or whatever it is that you have in mind for this deal of yours. Ah. I don't think you quite understand what I'm talking about here, Guri said. You think I want you to steal something physical and that I'm offering you money in exchange. Yes. Zorian raised an eyebrow at him. Nothing could be further from the truth. Guri shook his head. I know better than anyone that you're raking in too much money at the moment to be tempted by petty burglary. Ethics aside, that's too much risk for too little gain. No. If this operation goes off without a hitch, and I think you're capable enough to pull it off, there will be nothing missing and no indication that a crime has occurred at all. He leaned towards Zorian conspiratorially and whispered the next part. You see, what I'm trying to steal is not material wealth, but secrets. Oh. Oh. Well, that changed things considerably. He still didn't want to have anything to do with Guri's deal. But he at least understood why the man felt comfortable discussing such an offer with him. Spying on other mages was technically illegal. But everyone knew it was a common and universal practice. Hell. According to some stories, every noble house worth its name had its own division dedicated just to that. You just had to make sure that you weren't caught. Even the Academy, which generally tried to give students a very rose-tinted version of mage culture, admitted that such professional espionage occurred all the time. Some of it was entirely legal, such as analyzing a rival's products and spellwork with divination spells, or poring over publicly available documents to see if they'd let something sensitive slip by without noticing. But such legal methods were usually very limited, and mages often resorted to shadier methods, bribing assistants and apprentices into selling out their master's secrets, hiring burglars to raid archives and research notes, dedicated scrying campaigns, seduction plots. The possibilities were endless, and new ones were devised every day, as well as countermeasures for such. Zorian recalled a particular fable that spoke of two mages that spent years devising ways to steal each other's secrets and thwarting the other's attempts to do the same to them. Eventually, after a decade of back and forth, they both succeeded in reaching each other's inner sanctum at the same time, only to find out that neither had any secrets worth stealing. They had spent so much time and effort trying to one-up each other that they'd never gotten any actual work done. Well, that was an obvious exaggeration. But it honestly wouldn't surprise Zorian to find out that every magical business, and probably quite a few non-magical ones, in Nyazov Dveri did do at least a little bit of illegal espionage as a matter of course. The world of business was a cutthroat environment. Zorian knew from his parents' stories that even seemingly simple and honest farmers were willing to renege on their contracts if they thought they could get away with it. To someone like Guri, this sort of thing was probably just business as usual. But it wasn't business as usual for Zorian. And frankly, Guri was completely right when he said that the whole thing was a huge risk for little gain. He opened his mouth to give Guri a firm, but polite, refusal. But was interrupted when Guri pushed a brown, leather-bound book in his hands. Zorian looked at the book in surprise for a second, idly wondering why it had no title. Before giving Guri a searching look, the man motioned him to open it. Zorian did. And promptly found himself leafing through pages of handwritten notes and complicated diagrams. It was a journal of some sort. That's why the book had no title or markings. A research journal of some mage. If he had to guess. "What is this?" he asked, giving Guri a suspicious look. "A sample," Guri said with a grin. "As I said, I know it would be foolish of you to do something like this for money well. For the sums I am able to pay you. At least so I came up with something that will hopefully be more attractive to you. Feel free to peruse that thing at your leisure and then come see me in my store tomorrow to give me an answer. Just remember, there is more where that came from." Guri then immediately left, leaving Zorian alone with the mysterious journal/thing. Curious. He opened the book at the beginning so he could see if it perhaps had a title written on the first page. The first few pages were blank. But he did reach the title page in the end. "Breaking and bypassing wards and other magical defenses," it said. By Aldwin Rafolton. Rafolton? That would be Guri's deceased business partner. Wouldn't it? Intrigued, Zorian sat down on the edge of his bed and began to read. Having read through Rafolton's book, Zorian had to admit he was feeling a little underwhelmed. It wasn't a bad book by any means. But by the way Guri had presented it, he'd expected more. As it was, the most useful thing he found inside was the step-by-step instruction of how to build your very own magic analysis goggles, complete with a spell formula blueprint. That was convenient, as he had been meaning to build one of those for a while now, and there were no publicly available creation manuals on the topic that he could find. The spell formula blueprint alone probably saved him a restart worth of work. Other than that, there was little of real use in there, but perhaps that was what Guri had been aiming for. It was a sample, as he said, meant to entice Zorian into cooperation by alluding to the possibility of granting Zorian access to the rest of Rafolton's books. If Guri's old partner had 5 other books like that, and each one had just one useful thing like the goggle thing, that was a couple of months of saved time right there. And if Guri was keeping the good stuff for the end like Zorian suspected, tempting. Far more tempting than he'd thought this would be. Shaking his head at his own greed, he locked his room behind him and set off in the direction of Guri's shop. He would have to check with the man what exactly he expected of him. But chances were he was going to say yes. In truth, this sort of thing wasn't that far off from what he had been planning to do on his own at some point. Chances were that he was going to have to learn how to break into people's homes and spy on mages sooner or later, gathering information about the time loop. Red robe and soul magic was bound to require it at some point. At least this way he would get some guidance from someone who'd done it before. Get a chance to practice his skills on what was probably a far less difficult target. And get paid for it to boot. Realizing he was in no hurry to actually confront Guri, Zorian eventually slowed down and decided to take the scenic route to the place. He idly observed the people and buildings as he wandered the town, suddenly aware that he knew very little about the place. Despite living in it for a while now, he had been so busy with other things that actually exploring Nyazovd very sort of slipped his mind. He didn't even peruse the town's dungeon access. Though that one was intentional, he had decided to hold back on doing that until he had a chance to judge how much of his time and attention his other tasks in this restart would take. And ultimately decided to leave that for some other restart. The dungeon wasn't going anywhere. In any case, now that he had taken the time to explore the town a little, he could say with some certainty that he hadn't missed much. He had already visited most of the shops to determine what the best price for the ingredients he was gathering was. And aside from that, the town was fairly average. It was similar to Scioria in the sense that it was clearly a city that had experienced rapid growth in recent times. The old core of the city was easily recognizable by the singlestory buildings painted in the traditional yellow color that usually signified Eldamar's native architecture, while subsequent layers radiating from it had newer, multi-story buildings. Other than that, he hadn't noticed anything particularly noteworthy, though he would have to set aside some days for exploration just to be certain. Finally, he reached the building that proudly proclaimed it housed a business establishment known as Quilly and Rafulton Equipment and walked inside. The little bell attached to the door rang out as Zorian entered, notifying Guri of his arrival, a solution surprisingly devoid of magic. For a magic store, and the portly man soon poked his head from the back room he was currently in to see what he was dealing with. His eyes lit up immediately when he recognized Zorian. "I'll be with you in a second," the man yelled before getting back to whatever he was working on in the back. Zorian took the chance to study the shop a bit while he waited. Just like the first time he had been here, he was once again struck by how diverse the products sold by Guri's store were. He offered everything from wilderness-appropriate attire to the various magic items, potions, survival guides, dried herbs and other magical materials used by alchemists and artificers, and so on. And actually, it was even more impressive than it first appeared. Zorian knew from his previous talks with the man that Guri actually offered a great deal more than what was displayed at the shelves of his store, so long as the customer seeking them was properly vouched for or knew how to ask the right questions. Guri once told a story about a customer who tried to buy the decorative potted plants he strategically placed around the shop to liven up the place. And while Zorian understood Guri's mirth at the incident, he also understood how someone might have decided they were for sale. With all the other things Guri was selling, it really wouldn't have surprised Zorian to find out that he dealt in potted plants as well. "Ah, Zorian, my friend," said Guri, walking out from the back and approaching him. "Did you read it? An interesting book, isn't it?" he prodded. "It was somewhat useful," said Zorian noncommittally. "Not much on its own. But if there really are a couple more where that came from, it might actually be worthwhile for me to work with you on your problem." Guri frowned, apparently expecting him to be more impressed with his partner's work. He opened his mouth to speak, but Zorian interrupted him. "Before we discuss this any further, I'd prefer if we moved to somewhere more private. Do you have a room I could set up some basic privacy wards in?" "I have better," Guri said smugly, quickly shaking off his previous disappointment. "I have a room with privacy wards already present, and not just the basic ones either. Follow me." He led Zorian to a small, inconspicuous room with a single desk and 2 chairs, a room whose walls, floor and ceiling were full of magical glyphs and geometric shapes made out of crystallized mana. Guri placed his hand on one of the circles and the whole complicated spell formula pulsed twice in bright blue light before becoming seemingly inert. Zorian wasn't fooled though; those pulses signified the more mana-intensive portions of the ward scheme becoming active. Much like many powerful warding schemes, the one he was looking at had 2 modes: the normal, mana-conserving one that could be powered indefinitely from its mana source, and the advanced, Supercharged one that burned through mana faster than the ambient mana levels could provide it with, but was far more effective for the time it was active. The sound of Guri clearing his throat jolted him out of his thoughts, and he realized he had been studying the wards for quite a while now. Oops. Is this one also somewhat useful? Asked Guri with a smirk when he realized he had Zorian's attention again. No. This is quite impressive, Zorian admitted. Is this also made by your former partner? Yes, Guri nodded. He was quite good at this. Setting up wards. I mean. Also breaking and bypassing them. But I understand those two are related. Learn how to make a ward and you're 90% there to figuring out how to defeat it. That's the conventional wisdom. Yes, agreed Zorian. He decided not to dance around the issue any longer. So I'm guessing your former partner was your go-to person for these kinds of deals in the past. And now that he's dead, you need to find someone else to do your dirty work. You're direct, Guri laughed nervously. But you've hit the nail on the head. More or less. You see, magic was never my thing. As strange as that may sound from an owner of a magic shop. That was always Aldwin's thing. He was the one that worried about the spellcasting part of the business, while I was always more comfortable on the more mundane civilian side of things. Making contacts. Closing deals. Finding new business partners. That kind of thing. I'm a really terrible mage when it comes down to it. I can barely cast anything at all. Zorian gave him a curious look. I'm pretty sure I saw you manipulate mana plenty of times. And activating the greater privacy mode of this room couldn't have possibly been a matter of just channeling mana into that circle. Oh. I was always very good at using magic items, Guri said. You don't need to be a proper mage to do that. Lots of practice and some specialized shaping exercises and you're set. If you're fairly wealthy like me and live on a mana well, you can even commission items that draw power from the ambient mana instead of from my own minuscule reserves, but we both know there are severe drawbacks to such items. And this sort of job really needs a proper spellcaster. Zorian nodded. He had been considering the possibility of using self-casting magic items to make up for his below-average mana reserves for a while now. But there were a lot of problems with it. The core, inescapable issue was that souls of spellcasters were pretty damn good at spellcasting. While even the best-made magic items weren't. Making an item that allowed the caster to skip some of the steps during spellcasting was simple enough. But creating something that was capable of casting a spell entirely on its own upon command? Hard. Possibly very hard. Or even impossible. Depending on what spell you were trying to imprint into the item. Warding schemes and one-use magic items like his suicide explosive cubes got around the issue by having the maker cast the spell during creation. After which the spell formula simply stabilized it and kept it from degrading. But that workaround wasn't very useful for the majority of spells. And then there was the issue of powering said items. Not every place had much in the way of ambient mana. And even places that did often couldn't provide the amount necessary for the spell at once. That meant that most self-casting items needed an internal mana battery. Which brought a whole host of problems of its own. No battery was totally efficient and reliable. They all leaked mana in varying amounts. And could easily blow up if overcharged or poorly constructed. And that was without even getting into the number of actual combat spells that were specifically designed to make mana batteries blow up from internal pressure. All in all, the creation of self-casting items was something that Zorian put squarely into the probably not worth it category. He wasn't nearly good enough with spell formula currently to pull it off. And even if he were, it was still a very difficult subfield of magic item creation that gave very dubious gains. Though he did eventually intend to track down a blueprint for a blasting rod, probably the simplest of self-casting items that blasted whatever it was pointed at with a torrent of barely constrained energy. Usually fire. A fittingly named item. And one of the few self-casting items that was known to be reliable and effective in actual combat. At least at close range. It was not a priority. However, such an item would be more of a last resort. Sidearm sort of weapon than something to build his skills around. I'm not as useless at this sort of cloak and dagger stuff as you might think. Though, Guri said. As I said. Aldwin was the spellcaster. But I was the one who identified the targets. You can't spy on a threat unless you know they are a threat. After all. And I was always very good at spotting who our competition was and keeping an eye on their activities. People underestimate how much information you can get simply by being well connected and giving a few expensive gifts to people. You mean bribes, said Zorian. Zorian. My friend. You have much to learn, Guri said. Shaking his head. Bribes are illegal. There is no law against generosity. Giving that bottle of expensive wine to your drinking buddy or inviting someone to that fancy annual dance that they've always wanted to attend is just being nice and no one can prove otherwise. Right, Zorian sighed. I guess I shouldn't talk. Since I'm willing to go along with your plans. And speaking of which. Why don't we get back to the reason we're here in the first place? What exactly do you want from me and what are you offering? Very well. I presume you know about Vazen's general store. The biggest magic-related shop in town, asked Zorian. That one. Yes. Quilly and Rafulton equipment was once bigger and able to compete with them on a more equal footing. But since the death of my partner 2 years ago those days have passed. Recently they have closed a deal with another company from Scioria. But they have been silent about the contents of the deal. Everyone knows they have bought a bunch of spell formula schematics, alchemical recipes and production licenses. So it's obvious they intend to seriously branch out into the production side of the business. But the exact details have been successfully kept secret. That is a problem. Depending on what Vazen intends to produce. Some things are going to decline sharply in value. While the price of the raw materials used to make them goes up to a similar degree. I see. You need to see what your rival will release so that you can prepare for the impact it will have on the market, mused Zorian. Well. That and so that I can see if it is possible to counter his move in some fashion, Guri said. I suppose you know where I can find that information? Zorian asked. Not in the shop itself. I hope. That place is bound to be heavily warded. It's not nearly as warded as you might think. Some basic counters to stop teleportation and divination. And that's about it. But the place is always manned. Even during the night. So you're right that they're not something you'd want to tangle with. Fortunately. You don't have to. In the end. Vazen's own paranoia is his undoing. I have found out that instead of keeping the documents in his heavily guarded shop, he has brought them into his much less protected home. Apparently he doesn't even trust his own employees. How protected is his home? Asked Zorian. Well. My information might be a little outdated since I got it 2.5 years ago. From my then living partner who scouted the entire building. But I doubt much has changed. It has an anti-divination ward and all the doors and windows have intruder alarms and that's it. The documents themselves are kept in a safe. Though. And that is bound to have much more serious defenses. Not too bad of a setup. To be honest, Zorian said after thinking about it for a minute. The divination ward stops casual espionage and makes it impossible to just scry and teleport inside. While the alarms on entrances make it impossible to simply sneak inside without magic. Covering only the entrances with the wards was a common mannequin-serving measure. True. It made the wards useless if the attackers could phase through walls or were willing to make their own entrance by blowing a hole in the building. But thieves capable of phasing through solid matter had bigger fish to fry than robbing small-time shop owners, and blasting holes in the walls would kind of defeat the point of trying to acquire the information undetected. You can teleport, though. Right? Asked Guri. I mean, I'm sure you can. The speed of movement over large distances that you've demonstrated pretty much requires it, but how good are you at it? I can teleport, Zorian said hesitantly. He didn't think he was making it that obvious. Though he supposed he couldn't keep leaving in the morning and coming back before the sun set with things only found deep in the forest without someone questioning just how he was doing it. I'm getting pretty good at it. In my opinion. It takes me a while to shape the spell. But I can consistently pull it off. Excellent. The intruder alarms shouldn't be much of a problem. Then, Guri said with a grin. Aldwin had this neat trick where he could turn an item into a teleport beacon of sorts. And then simply teleport himself to its location without having to have been there in the past. I'm sure I can get some innocuous-seeming thing through the door. You just have to cast the spell on it. I don't know how to cast the spell myself. But Aldwin did write it down in one of his journals. Spell. You say. No spell formula involved, asked Zorian curiously. No. Spell of recall. I think it's called. It's a two-part spell. You first cast a personal teleport beacon on an item. And it immediately forges a connection between you and it. You can then cast the second spell at any time, causing yourself to be recalled at the location of the item. According to Aldwin, it was meant to be used for rapid escape. You cast the first spell on a retreat point and then use the second spell to teleport there if you end up in a bind. Why not use a regular teleport for that, frowned Zorian. Sounds like a lot of trouble when a normal teleport will suffice. After all, you've already been to the location you're teleporting to if you're setting it up as a retreat point. I really don't know. You will have to find that out yourself if you're interested, Guri said. So assuming this spell works as advertised and you can smuggle something in like you said you would. I just have to defeat the protection on the safe to get to the documents. Yes. That part will be all you. Since I have no idea where it is or what protections it has, confirmed Guri. Zorian stared at the man for a while before taking a deep breath. Lovely. Unfortunately for you, I am not the professional ward breaker you seem to think I am, he told Guri. When you said you wanted my help with this, I had thought I would just play support or something. Something like this is, to put it bluntly, out of my league. I'm sorry. But unless there is something you're not telling me, there is no way I'd be able to pull this off. Guri leaned forward and gave him a conspiratorial grin. Even if I gave you Aldwin's spellbook and his notes on how the spells are meant to be used? Zorian blinked. What? 2 hours later. Zorian left Guri's shop with 3 new books under his arm. They had agreed to make the attempt at the documents 3 days before the summer festival. Ostensibly to give Zorian the time he needed to practice the spells in Aldwin's spellbook, but also because that way, should the whole thing go pear-shaped, Zorian would only lose 3 days of the restart. Zorian hummed to himself in satisfaction as he walked back to the inn. It was nice to catch a windfall from time to time. After the whole annoyance with Silver Lake and the mysterious disappearance of soul magic practitioners, he had begun to think that this whole restart had been a giant waste of time. Now well, at least he'd gotten some shiny new spells out of it. Ones of the sort that he could never have acquired through any legal avenue. Things were looking up. After his talk with Guri, time passed quickly. It was difficult to practice the spells found in Aldwin's spellbook, as most of them only interacted with wards and required an actual warding scheme as a target. Thankfully, Zorian had managed to find a warded house whose owner had left on a trip, allowing Zorian to practice on it to his heart's content, provided he kept out of sight of the main road. He also occasionally warded objects himself for practice purposes. Usually when practicing the more destructive spells. But that just wasn't the same as interacting with an unknown ward. Surprisingly, Guri was also willing to have Zorian practice the spells on his shop's warding scheme. So long as he didn't do anything permanent. Zorian wondered about that. All things considered, Guri was being far too accommodating to him. He suspected that the portly man thought of him as an investment and hoped to turn him into a more long-term asset. And as such was rather more generous to Zorian than he otherwise would have been. But he had no way to be sure. There did not seem to be anything malicious about it. So he mostly ignored it and tried to be simply grateful for his good fortune. There were essentially 3 ways of dealing with wards. The first one was to starve the ward out, depriving it of mana until it simply fell apart. The second was to identify a way to disrupt its structure, causing it to fail on the spot. And finally, the third one was to trick it into not activating in the first place. Siphoning, breaking, and bypassing were the terms used in literature for the 3 methods. Each one had its advantages and disadvantages. But for the task Guri entrusted him, he would have to rely on bypassing the wards on the safe. Siphoning had the advantage that it always worked. Every ward could be siphoned to death with enough time and effort. It was just a question if the attacker was willing to devote the necessary resources for the task. Some wards could last for months after being isolated from their power sources, even when actively drained of mana during the isolation. Unfortunately, it required that the attacker have complete control of the area around the ward. As siphoning operations were difficult to set up and maintain, anything less than total control made it too easy for the defender to wreck the setup. It was mostly used for sieges and bringing down legacy wards that had outlived their usefulness. Breaking was the fastest method of neutralizing wards. Just disrupt the structure of the ward and let it collapse on itself. Unfortunately, many wards collapsed explosively or had other unpleasant side effects if simply broken, often resulting in the destruction of the warded thing and sometimes the one doing the breaking as well. A lot of wards were also simply too powerful to be broken by a single mage, or even a group of mages, unless the attacker had identified a particularly glaring weakness. So all in all, breaking a ward was often not possible. And, even more often, not desirable even if the possibility existed. Still, if one wanted to get rid of a ward quickly and had power to spare, breaking the ward was the way to go. Finally, there was bypassing the wards, the preferred way of dealing with them, if at all possible. If the attacker knew how the ward functioned, either because he had been given access to the schematics of the warding scheme or because he had analyzed its structure via divination spells, they could take care not to activate any of the triggers that made the ward recognize there was a problem to be countered. Depending on how the ward functioned, it might even be possible to put additional layers on top of it to neutralize it completely. If an attacker wanted to keep their intrusion secret, bypassing the wards was a must, as it was the only method that left the wards intact after they were done. Since the idea was to leave no trace of his home invasion, he obviously couldn't break or siphon the wards on the safe. He had to trick his way past them and leave them intact. There were lots of ways to do that in the books Guri had given him, since Aldwin was primarily interested in that sort of solution to the wards himself. But until Zorian took an actual look at the safe, he couldn't tell which ones he should use. So he settled on simply practicing all of them. As the date of the summer festival approached, Zorian decided to visit Vani one more time to see if the man had any news on the missing soul mages. He didn't, though he admitted he hadn't tried to find out anything about that very hard. It was a matter for law enforcement, Vani had claimed, and getting involved would just paint them as suspects. He was probably right. And Zorian knew there was no point in snooping around now that the case was being investigated by the police. But he definitely intended to launch a personal investigation in future restarts to see what was going on there. Vani had asked him whether he had found the shifter tribe. But Zorian admitted that he sort of gave up on that. He couldn't go to Rainey, as she was in Scioria. And nobody else could direct him where to go. Or maybe they could. But didn't want to. The result was the same in either case. Besides, he was skeptical in regard to how much they could actually help with his issue. After an hour of waiting, Vazen left the house and Zorian teleported inside. Guri remained outside under an invisibility field, acting as a lookout if he spotted Vazen coming back. He would press a button on the stopwatch Zorian had given him, which would cause a ring on Zorian's hand to heat up. The house was, thankfully, completely empty but also completely lacking in safes, warded or otherwise. Even after he'd added an additional layer to the wards in order to exclude the inside of the house from the anti-divination ward. His spells still gave no results, probably because the safe was itself warded against divinations. Frustrating. It was obviously hidden behind something. But Zorian couldn't figure out where. There were no hollow walls. Secret hatches beneath the carpet. Places where the floor was scraped due to constant movement of furniture. And so on. Just as Zorian was about to give up and hit the books for an exotic divination spell that could work despite the ward, he finally found it. It was in the fireplace. Of all things, if he hadn't noticed how relatively clean it was, and reminisced about how much he hated cleaning the one back home in Siren, it would have never occurred to him to look there. The fireplace was not built for convenient access. So interacting with it was rather annoying. The safe was positioned to the left, making it impossible to actually see the lock without the use of a mirror. Still, that was just an inconvenience, not a real obstacle. He began casting analysis spells at the ward that protected the safe, trying to find a way past them. He had just enough time to register that there was a very weak, localized ward present in the fireplace before he was forced to jump back and erect a shield in front of him. A deafening explosion erupted from the fireplace, enveloping the whole room in blinding, choking ash as the ward triggered the explosive trap in response to detecting his analysis spell. His shield protected him from the blast, but the ash cloud was hell on his lungs. He teleported out, grabbed Guri and then teleported again, this time away from Vazen's house. The operation was a bust. In the aftermath of the botched operation, the whole idea had been scrapped. Security was bound to go up now that Vazen knew there was someone after the documents. And Zorian didn't fancy going against the new and improved defenses when even the old ones nearly killed him. Guri was, if anything, even more shaken about the whole thing than Zorian was. He apologized profusely for the whole episode and ranted about how such lethal traps were illegal and how he couldn't believe Vazen would employ such a thing. Which Zorian found more than a little amusing. It helped explain why Vazen seemingly didn't bother to report the break-in to the police. Though, personally, Zorian was feeling pretty annoyed with himself. Despite what Guri seemed to think, this was all on him. He really should have checked the fireplace for traps. Hell, he should have checked the whole house for those. Just because Guri had said there were no other defenses didn't mean he should have taken it for granted. The man had even said his information was outdated. Well, no matter, he got some nifty spells out of the whole thing and he knew what to watch out for in subsequent restarts. He thought about confronting the Grey Hunter at the end of the restart, but then decided against it. He would have just died messily. And he'd had enough brushes with death in this particular restart. He went to sleep and woke up with his sister wishing him a good morning. Zorian stared at the grinning face of his opponent. His own face a blank, expressionless mask. This was it. This last round would decide who the victor was. No question about it. His opponent thought he had Zorian backed into a corner. But Zorian had a secret weapon. He had already peered into the man's thoughts and knew that he had already won. The rules of the card game were pretty clear. After all. 12 of pumpkins, Zorian said, placing his last card on the table. The man's face instantly lost its grin. Zorian tried to keep a cool Ade. But he probably smiled at least a little. Motherf, how are you this lucky, the man cursed. Slapping down his own card on top of the stack, a measly 7 of oaks. Not nearly enough to win, and taking a swig from the glass of hard liquor next to him. He drank way too much in Zorian's opinion. His thoughts steadily growing more and more muddied to Zorian's mental probes as time went by, and while that did make him harder to read via psychic powers, it also made him progressively worse at playing the game. He probably didn't even need to cheat to win the last 2 games. But cheating was kind of the whole point. He joined the card game to practice his mind-reading skills in a real environment. Not to win money off hapless victims. Well. This is it for me, Zorian said. Standing up. It was fun and all. But I really have to get going now. Hey. You can't just leave now, the man protested. Frowning at him. That's not how it's done. You have to give me a chance to win my money back. Orinus. You're drunk, one of the other men at the table said. The 2 of them dropped out 3 games ago. But they still stuck around to talk. Drink. And act as judges and money holders. You didn't lose anything. It's the kid who just got back the money he lost to you in the previous game. Nobody has to pay anyone anything. Yeah. The last 5 games have basically been for nothing, the other man piped in. Zorian nodded. Even with mind reading on his side. Some hands were just unwinnable. Besides, he purposely threw a couple of games so as to not arouse suspicions of cheating in his partners. We're both even at this point. And I really have to get going. So it's a perfect place to stop, he said. Still. If you're that desperate for a rematch, I can always relieve you of your money some other day. I'll be staying in the town for a whole month anyway. You relieve me of my money. Ha! The only reason you haven't ended up in your underwear is that you're immune to my secret technique. Orinus half shouted. Hey man! Don't reveal all my tricks to outsiders. What kind of friend are you? Orinus protested. After a few more minutes of bickering and refused offers of alcoholic beverages, Zorian finally managed to excuse himself. Ignoring Orinus's muttered questioning of Zorian's masculinity due to his refusal to drink anything remotely alcoholic, he left the inn and started searching the streets of Nyazov Dveri for an out-of-the-way corner he could teleport from without being seen. The game had been both unexpectedly fun and useful for his mind magic training. But he hadn't been lying when he had said he had to get going. Timing was crucial for what he intended to do. In the previous restart he learned that most of the soul mages on Kale's list had disappeared or died recently. That was, of course, highly suspicious. There was a good chance the whole thing was somehow connected to the time loop. Which meant he had to know more about it. Sadly, during the last restart he had made the mistake of telling Vani about the disappearances. And he had raised enough of an alarm to have the police crawling everywhere around potential clue sites. Consequently, Zorian had been forced to set the issue aside and wait for the next restart to conduct his own investigation. Which is exactly what he did. The moment he woke up in Siren and could leave without making Mother and Kiriel throw a fit. As he suspected, virtually all of the soul mages had been already gone. Even on that very first day. Whatever had happened to them had been going on for far longer than the time loop existed. It seemed. There were only 2 exceptions. The 2 mages that were confirmed dead in the previous restart were alive and well at the start of the new one. The first one, a priest named Alanik Zosk specializing in fighting undead, had simply been found dead with no obvious cause a few days into the restart. The second one was Lukav Teklo, an alchemist specializing in transformation magic. He had been killed by boars not far from his home, on the evening of the second day of the restart. Naturally, Zorian intended to talk with both of them, which necessitated saving their lives. The alchemist was a priority, as he died sooner and the cause of death was known and easily preventable. Thus his hurry to leave the game if he timed things correctly. He would arrive at the man's home an hour or two before his fateful stroll outside the village. If he mistimed things or his actions somehow caused the alchemist to accelerate his schedule, well, there were always future restarts. It's not like the man would die for good. He could have contacted the man sooner to warn him, he supposed. But how would he explain his knowledge of the attack? He'd just make himself look suspicious. And besides, he actually wanted the attack to happen. He doubted those were regular boars that attacked him. So he wanted to examine them up close, and also, the man was bound to be a lot more helpful if he met Zorian as a savior who protected him from a vicious pack of boars than if he just showed up at the man's door with no warning. After teleporting just outside the man's house and making sure the alchemist was still in his house, Zorian settled in for a wait, making sure to keep out of sight of any windows. If there was anything that tiny villages like this one never had a shortage of, it was nosy old people who had nothing better to do except watch the streets for anything out of the ordinary. Honestly, some of the old women back in Siren spent practically every waking moment glued to their window sills, making note of everyone that passed through their domain. He lost count of the number of times they got him into trouble with his parents when he had foolishly forgotten to account for their presence. He didn't have to wait long. Barely half an hour after he had settled in to wait, the alchemist left his house. It was a good thing he had come early. Then, Zorian promptly cast an invisibility spell on himself and then started following after the man some distance away. Hopefully he remained far enough that the man would not find it suspicious when Zorian burst onto the scene at the first sign of trouble. But that couldn't be helped. He didn't feel comfortable putting even more distance between the two of them, lest the man be killed before he could come to his aid. Depending on how oblivious and combat capable the man was, he could get overwhelmed in seconds. And the attack itself was bound to happen any moment now. The report he saw in the last restart said the man was killed just outside the village. And Lukav had immediately made a beeline towards the main road leading to the next settlement. Cautiously, Zorian drew his spell rod and strained his mind's sense to the limit in order to find the attackers before they could strike. He found nothing out of the ordinary, and was thus just as shocked as the alchemist, and a bunch of boars burst out of the tree line and charged the man. They both froze for a second, and before either could react the boars had already closed half of the distance to the alchemist. Embarrassingly enough, the alchemist reacted first. With a practiced movement, he threw a bottle of some sort into the path of the approaching horde and immediately dropped on the ground. Lacking the alchemist's reflexes and thinking himself too far to be affected by the bomb, Zorian opted to simply drop invisibility and erect a shield in front of him as a precaution. That turned out to be a mistake, as the deafening explosion of light and sound left him dazed and blinking spots out of his vision for the next few seconds. When he did recover, he saw that the bomb's effect on the boars themselves had been underwhelming. They had been thrown about by the blast, as had the alchemist himself, having misjudged the distance somewhat in his panic. And the leading boar that had been caught in the center of the blast had been blown to bits. But the others were already up on their feet and converging on their target. Even the one with a broken leg was stubbornly stumbling towards the dazed, bleeding alchemist, undeterred by what should have been excruciating pain. They made no sounds. They were unafraid of loud sounds and bright light, and completely ignored severe injuries like they were nothing. So much for the idea that they were ordinary animals. Oh well. He kind of suspected it was something like this. Acting quickly to stop them from killing the other man, he cast a swarm of 5 magic missiles at the boars closest to the downed alchemist. Smashers instead of piercers, if he was right about what these things really were. Holes in their bodies wouldn't even slow them down. The missiles were there just to knock them away from their target and give Zorian time to cast another, more unorthodox spell that he didn't put in his spell rod. Oh. And possibly shift their attention towards him instead. Though he didn't think anything could make them switch targets. They were clearly sent to kill a specific man. The smashers hit the boars in their flanks, sending them tumbling. As he suspected. They immediately scrambled to get up as if nothing happened. And the other 4 kept running towards the alchemist. He had finished his spell before they could reach him. However, causing a large shining disk of force to materialize between his hands. The severing disk was a powerful cutting spell that was surprisingly mana efficient and allowed the caster to pilot the disk, changing its flight path at will. Taven had not thought much of it, as it was not a fear and forget sort of combat spell, requiring constant concentration from the mage to keep existing. And it moved pretty slowly for a magical projectile. 2. According to Taven, competent mages would dispel the disk before it could reach them or otherwise evade it. And the caster is something of a sitting duck while directing the disk. But the boars couldn't dispel it, and had no ranged attacks to take advantage of his lack of shields. At Zorian's direction, the disk shot forward, flying close to the ground at the height that Zorian judged to be around knee height for the boars. Zorian's fears that he had overestimated the power of the disk and that it would not be able to cut through the bones of tough animals like the boars proved completely unfounded. The disk encountered the legs of the first boar and simply passed through with no visible resistance. In its wake, the boar fell apart. Its legs separated from its torso. Directed by Zorian, the disk continued towards the rest of them. In the end, it was a close thing. On one hand, the boars didn't even try to dodge, charging in straight lines that made them easy to intercept with the disk. On the other hand, Zorian had not practiced the spell in question particularly heavily, so he missed 2 boars on his first pass. Thankfully, the alchemist had recovered by this point and helpfully dealt with the 2 stragglers by causing an arc of spear-like spikes to erupt from the ground in front of him with some kind of alteration spell. The boars were so insistent on getting to him as fast as possible that they impaled themselves on the makeshift rampart and got stuck. Zorian let the disk dissipate with a sigh. That was a win. Yes. But he wasn't satisfied with his performance. He'd frozen at the start. And his mastery of the severing disk spell left much to be desired. But what was done was done. And at least he achieved what he came here to do. Time to face the music. He set off towards the alchemist, who was kneeling on the ground and alternating between staring at the approaching Zorian and at the still twitching, legless boars not far from him. He frowned at them as he approached. They had no minds. He realized. That was why he didn't detect them until they attacked as far as his mind sense was concerned. They didn't exist. Coupled with the fact they were still alive with their limbs cut off and that their wounds didn't bleed at all, the conclusion was obvious. His hunch had been right, they were definitely undead. As far as he knew, the only beings that counted as mindless for the purposes of mind magic were oozes, golems, creatures under the mind-blank spell, and the so-called mindless undead. The boars were clearly neither golems or oozes. And he doubted mind-blank was involved. It would also explain why they seemed to have no blood and felt no pain or hesitation. "Are you all right there? You kind of took the worst of that blast," said Zorian, shifting his attention towards the man he came here to save. Now that he was close to the man, He could see that Lukav Teklo was a fairly handsome middle-aged man, sporting long black hair, a carefully sculpted beard and rather muscular physique. Zorian was a little surprised by this, as he had expected someone wilder. After all, his fellow villagers had told him that the man disdained human contact and preferred to spend his time in the wilderness. Yeah. I'm all right, the man said, rising to his feet before swaying dangerously. Zorian quickly caught him and helped him regain his balance. Damn it. Hoisted on my own petard. Literally. Didn't even accomplish anything with it. Totally ignored my patented animal repellent. That's some compulsion they were under. I'm pretty sure they're undead, Zorian said. What? Really? Lukav said, squinting at the closest boar. My vision is a little blurry right now. Is it really trying to wriggle towards me still? I think so. Yeah, Zorian confirmed. Lukav barked out a stream of words in some Kusky language that Zorian didn't recognize. He was pretty sure they were swear words. Though. So maybe it was better that way. I'm sorry, the man said after a few calming breaths. I don't mean to be rude. I want to thank you. Young man. I was lucky you happened upon me when you did. I surely would have died otherwise. Well. It wasn't entirely luck, Zorian said, causing the man to give him a hard look. You are Lukav Teklo. Yes. The man nodded. I have been looking for you based on the recommendation you received from one of my friends. One Kale Tveranov. Ah. Kale. Lukav immediately brightened. Great kid. Shame he stopped coming when he got engaged to that witch girl. I was hoping to recruit him as an apprentice. But I'm afraid Freya got to him first, and unlike her, I didn't have a cute daughter of my own to tempt him away with. Talented alchemist. That boy. I'd ask you how he's doing. But we can do that in my house. When I calm down a little. That would be fine, Zorian said. Though I want to take a look at these undead boars that attacked you. First. I'm pretty sure someone just tried to murder you. I don't think undead boars arise on their own. Oh no. Definitely not, Lukav agreed. Minor undead like that are basically flesh golems. Only with an enslaved soul or spirit placed inside instead of an automation core. The only naturally arising undead are ghosts and other soul entities. Alanik was always very clear on that. Not sure who would try to kill me. Of all people. But apparently I pissed off a necromancer somewhere. Just my luck. I'll report this to the guild and have them deal with this. But feel free to examine these things as much as you want in the meantime. I'm kind of curious myself. But divinations were never my thing, so. Zorian nodded and got to work. Using an alteration spell to bind the legless torso of the nearest boar so it wouldn't thrash and move around before moving to analyze it. As he feared. He didn't find out anything particularly useful and was forced to leave the scene to the guild investigators. At Lukav's advice he resummoned the severing disc and chopped all of the downed boars except one into smaller pieces that no longer moved. Lukav claimed that one undead boar was enough for the guild investigators and he didn't want to risk the attacker picking them up. Sewing the legs back on and sending them after him again. The last intact boar was buried deep into the soil via another alteration spell from Lukav. There to wait for guild investigators to arrive. Zombies. Skeletons and other undead are not nearly as easy to make as stories make them out to be, Lukav explained as they made way towards his house. Easier and cheaper to make than golems. Sure. But still a significant expenditure of alchemical ingredients and time. Losing a dozen zombies like that has got to be a major loss for whoever is targeting me. No sense in letting them recuperate losses by leaving the zombie boars in fixable condition. Alanik told me to always destroy any disabled undead after the battle. Just in case their maker is around to fix them back up. I didn't think I'd ever be in a position where that advice would be useful, but there you go. Forgive me. But is the Alanik you're talking about Alanik Zosk? Zorian asked. Why yes, Lukav confirmed. I suppose Kale recommended him too. Yes. He actually gave me a pretty long list of soul mages. You were just the first name on the list. He wasn't really. But it hardly mattered. The man motioned him to continue. I need your help with a piece of soul magic I got hit with. I don't feel comfortable talking about it here in the open. I hope you'll hear me out when we get to your home. Fair enough. But unless you got hit by a transformation curse, I don't think there is much I can do for you. Alanik is actually a better bet. He's no curse-breaking specialist. But he knows the basics of the field at least. Of course. It would have been even better to seek the help of the guild. But I'm guessing you have a good reason for not wanting to get them involved. I do, confirmed Zorian. And while I realize that the chance of you being able to help me is slim. Hey now. Those are fighting words, Lukav warned. I still hope you will hear me out and try to help me. It's entirely possible that you hold a crucial key to solving my problem. Even if you are unable to give me a total solution. My problem is not a curse. Exactly. It is exotic enough that Kale recommended Silver Lake as a possible solution if all else fails. Say what? Lukav asked incredulously. He recommended that crazy old witch as a solution for something. I know, Zorian sighed. I heard from a reputable source that she asked for a Grey Hunter egg sac from the last guy who asked her for help. Now that's just ridiculous, Lukav snorted derisively. Someone is pulling your leg. Not even Silver Lake would do that. Anyway. I'll see what I can do. It's the least I can do for someone who saved my life. After they had reached Lukav's house, the man penned a quick report to the nearest Mage Guild representative and paid one of the village boys to deliver it to Nyazov Dveri while they talked. Apparently the kid was a very good runner and had done such things for Lukav in the past. Regardless, it took a full hour for Lukav to tackle Zorian's problem. During which Zorian explained Kale's rather tragic situation to the man, and Lukav gradually calmed down and waited for the potion he ingested to take care of his concussion. Horrible. I thought that hearing about Kale would cheer me up after this whole ordeal. But it only makes me feel even more depressed, Lukav said. Zorian stayed silent, content to wait for Lukav to continue. After a few seconds of being lost in his thoughts, the man shook his head with a sigh. Well, I think the potion did its work by now. Since staring into the lamp no longer hurts my eyes and my head no longer feels like it's been stuffed with wool. Do you think you could tell me more about your problem now? The house has some basic wards to shut down scrying, but it's not professional work. Just something I had a friend make for me. The village doesn't have enough ambient mana to support anything substantial in terms of permanent wards. Anyway, I guess we could go to Nyazov Dveri and hire a private room in one of the more expensive inns. But that would cost a pretty penny, and I'm kind of averse to spending money like that. It's fine, said Zorian. He had already analyzed the man's warding scheme as practice and found it adequate. Slightly worse than Zorian could manage with a full day's work or so. But far better than a hastily erected privacy scheme that had been his original plan. After a few seconds to collect his thoughts, he began to talk. Telling the man about the time loop was absolutely out of the question. Of course. But that didn't mean he had to be totally vague about his situation. He told him how he stumbled upon a fight between a lich and an unknown mage, and was caught in the crossfire, getting hit by an unknown soul magic spell in the process. The other mage dispelled it, but the damage had already been done. After spending several weeks sick, he seemingly recovered. only to find out later that the spell had left its mark on him after all. Here Zorian went a little vague, refusing to state what the consequences he noticed were, simply insisting that the issue was private. Difficult, Lukav said unhappily when Zorian was finished. Knowing what the consequences were is a pretty crucial clue as to what the spell actually was. You know. You are sure it has nothing to do with transformation? Absolutely, Zorian confirmed. Not even partial transformations? The man asked. Remember. Not all transformations are total or involve obvious physical changes. The vast majority of magical enhancements are actually transformation. Even if they only do things like increase your strength and agility, they all call upon attributes of some other creature to do their thing, transforming the user in some non-obvious way. I didn't know that, Zorian admitted. But no. It's still not a transformation effect. It's actually more of an out-of-body experience, with my soul periodically leaving the body and then snapping back to it. So magical augmentations are generally transformation magic. Is that why they always seem to ask for animal parts and the like? Astral projection? Lukav asked. Makes sense. Some soul magic spells definitely weaken the links between the soul and the body if used incorrectly. And you said the spell the Lich cast on you had been botched. Not that letting the spell run its course had been a good idea. Mind you. But some of the necromantic arts are just as dangerous if dismissed incorrectly as they are in their raw form. You're definitely right to seek help over this. And yes, the parts of animals and magical creatures are there to provide an example of what you want to the transformation spell. Eagle Eye spell literally gives you the eyes of an eagle. For instance, transformation magic is very useful for such augmentation because it is very easy to reverse. It is? I thought transformation was dangerous, said Zorian. That was what they were taught in the academy. Well, maybe a little, the man admitted. But compared to the alternatives, it is incredibly safe. You see, when you cast a regular transformation spell on yourself, you are essentially putting clothes on your soul. Don't look at me like that. It's what it is. Yes. The official term is transformation shell. But they're basically like soul clothes. You can put them on. See. And you can take them off. Even if you mess up the spell and can't turn back, or you get locked into an alternate form by a malicious opponent, you are still just a dispel or a curse-breaking session away from returning to normal. Your soul is still intact and unchanged beneath the transformation shell. And once the spell is gone, you revert to your base form. The problem is that sometimes people overreach and end up transforming too far. So you end up with a mage, say, transforming into a troll in both mind and body and killing his entire family before the spell runs out of mana and he reverts back to normal. Or they attach the transformation shell too firmly to their soul and can't change back, and are then stuck in the form of a sparrow or something and can't talk to people or meaningfully interact with their environment. That's why a lot of people don't do transformation via invocations and rituals anymore. And just by transformation potions from people like me who know what they're doing, no chance of messing up. Just drink a potion made by an expert and you're golden. Ah. Other than the ritual circle on the floor, the room was empty and featureless, likely to minimize magical interference from anything else. Zorian hoped he would not have to get naked for this. He had heard some of the more delicate magical scans were actually bothered by clothes and the like, and wasn't at all enthusiastic about that possibility. Thankfully, Lukav's instructions didn't turn out to be that bad. All right. Leave any magical items on your person outside the room and then step into the center of the big circle. Right into that big empty space, he told Zorian. Zorian was more than a little apprehensive about leaving his magic items behind, since that would leave him totally defenseless. Especially the 3 innocuous-looking steel rings he had hanging on a necklace tucked into his shirt. Those rings were the latest iteration of his explosive suicide device that he had been steadily refining throughout the restarts. Anyone could make an explosive device with a bit of spell formula knowledge. Of course. But making them stable enough not to go off by themselves yet capable of going off on a moment's notice whenever he gives a signal. Shrouding the explosive mana core with enough divination blockers to make the bombs invisible to wards designed to detect those very kinds of devices. Thus allowing him to take those things literally everywhere he went. Including the tightly warded academy facilities. Making them small and convenient enough that they weren't a chore to carry around. Not everyone could do that. He was sure. In the end he decided to remove everything except the necklace. Getting killed by betrayal would suck but ultimately just be an annoyance. Whereas getting stuck in some kind of soul mutilation ritual without means of suicide would be irreparably catastrophic. He just didn't trust Lukav that much. Even if his empathy was telling him the man was honest enough and harbored no hostile feelings towards him. He quickly put his spell rod. Shielding bracelet. Bag of small explosive cubes, kept for offensive purposes, and the experimental automation core he had been fiddling with in his spare time into a small pile next to the door and walked inside. Lukav was already sitting inside the smaller circle, which also had an empty space in the center of it that could accommodate him easily. Zorian copied the man and promptly sat down on the stone floor inside the larger circle. He had a feeling this could take a while. Apparently Lukav's magic couldn't detect the necklace. Because he said nothing about it. You don't have any kind of soul shell on top of your soul, Lukav decreed after 15 minutes of examination. I kind of expected that. The sickness you said followed the spell that hit you strongly hints that part of your actual soul was affected. Let's see if I can detect any foreign bits in your soul then. Now this was the part that Zorian definitely cared about. He had been wondering for quite some time how big of a chunk of Zack's soul did he end up with and whether it was having some kind of effect on him that he was unaware of. Hopefully Lukav would be able to shed some light on that issue. After more than half an hour of spellcasting and lots of frowning, Lukav was finally ready to give his report. Weird. You definitely have something woven into your soul. But it's not like anything I've ever seen. Actually, you have two somethings. One is some kind of complicated bit of spellwork woven incredibly tightly into your soul. Definitely not soul stuff, but not something I recognize either. Very weird that something so complex could result from a botched spell. Not calling you a liar, but it doesn't make sense to me. The other something, well, it's definitely a piece of foreign soul stuff fused into your own soul. But I don't think you have to worry about that much. It's not a spirit or some soul parasite. And it seems to have all but dissolved into your own soul. In a year or two it will be gone entirely. Completely assimilated. What kind of consequences will that have? Zorian asked worriedly. None. I think. Your soul appears to be converting it into just another piece of itself rather than trying to keep it distinct. So there shouldn't be any major personality shifts and you probably won't get any nifty abilities from whomever or whatever it was that donated a part of their soul to you. Though, I guess it is possible that the fragment had affected your personality to an extent when you first got it. Before your soul had the chance to assimilate it sufficiently. And such influences may linger still. Do you think and act radically different ever since the incident? Zorian frowned. To be perfectly honest. Yes. I am quite different from how I used to be. But I'm not sure how much significance to attach to that. The incident was very traumatic. And so much has happened ever since then. I understand, Lukav nodded sympathetically. Your life has taken a completely different course after your fateful encounter with the darker side of magic. You would have changed anyway. And any changes caused by the soul fragment would have been lost in the noise. If you want my advice, you should not worry about it. You are who you are right now. And the fragment is all but gone. If shifters can claim to be the same person after stapling an animal's soul to their own, then I'm not sure why a little nudge from a soul fragment should worry you. It's in my nature to worry, Zorian said. Though admittedly the fact the fragment will be gone soon does make me feel better. Well, said Lukav, rising to his feet with an audible pop of his joints. I'm glad to have allayed at least some of your fears. But this is as much as I can personally help you. I'm afraid. For the strange spell work in your soul, you will have to talk to Alanik. He tends to be very suspicious of strangers and unannounced visitors. But I'll accompany you to smooth things over since you did save my life and all. Is there anything else you wanted my help with? Well, not really, said Zorian. But if I can trouble you some more. What can you tell me about shifters? You mentioned them several times while we talked today. Are you in contact with the local wolf shifter tribe by any chance? No. Not really, said Lukav, shaking his head. I mean, I could locate them if I had a week or so. But I'd really rather not. Talking to them is annoying. And they don't like me very much ever since I tried to buy the shifter ritual off of them that one time. Ah, said Zorian with some disappointment. It's just that I also talked to Vani, the local scholar in Nyazov Dveri. And he recommended I try to contact the local wolf shifters for help. Do you think the idea has any merit? In terms of whether their soul magic expertise could have helped you? Maybe. Though I wouldn't bet on it, said Lukav. But I really doubt they would agree to help you. The shifter tribe he speaks of, the Red Fong tribe, is fiercely protective of their special magic and suspicious of anyone who takes an interest in it. Hell, they don't even talk to other shifter tribes about it. Having nigh-exclusive access to shifter magic is very prestigious for them. And they don't want to share it with anyone. Then why did you offer to buy it off of them? Asked Zorian curiously. Well, I didn't know that then. Did I? How the hell was I supposed to know these things when they barely talk to anyone in the mage community? Groused Lukav. Okay. Yeah. I may have been a little too insistent. But they could have explained things to me politely instead of making such a big deal out of it. I see, said Zorian carefully. Lukav probably wasn't the best person to help him contact the shifters. It seemed. Just as well. Since he had a much likelier lead right now in the form of Alanik. He agreed he would drop by tomorrow in the evening to pick up Lukav. And that they would then go meet Alanik together. The two men were old friends according to Lukav. And Alanik would be easier to deal with if he was there to vouch for Zorian's character and honesty. Zorian hoped that the priest would be as useful as Lukav claimed he would be. The next day Zorian spent an entire morning practicing the severing disc to make sure he could actually control it properly the next time he used it. Switching to various levitation exercises when he got bored or ran low on mana. As evening approached, Zorian teleported to Lukav's village and spent an hour or so in idle chit-chat with the man. Zorian wasn't sure. But it seemed to him that the man had hinted at the possibility of teaching Zorian some of his secrets. Of course. There would probably be an apprenticeship contract involved if he wanted to take Lukav upon that offer. But with the time loop in place, such entanglements wouldn't be permanent in nature. Perhaps he should set aside a future restart or two to see what the man had to offer. But transformation magic simply wasn't a priority right now. He needed information and defenses against soul magic before anything else. Eventually, they both got on their way. Lukav had wanted to walk to Alanik's residence. But Zorian had vetoed the idea, arguing that would be a waste of time when he could just teleport them next to the man's house instead. Admittedly, his only experience in teleporting others had been when he had retreated from Vazen's house with Guri in tow. But he was confident he could replicate that success. And as it turned out, he was right about that. I'm surprised someone as young as you can teleport, Lukav said conversationally. Looking at their new surroundings to determine where exactly they ended up at. They were not far from the temple that Alanik worked at and which also served as his home. But Zorian opted not to teleport too close. As Lukav indicated that the man could be somewhat trigger-happy about such things. You're... what? 16. I guess I finally met one of those kid geniuses people talk about. You're not that Kaczynski. Are you? No. I just happen to have the same last name as Daimen, Zorian lied. Figures, the man said. You must get that question a lot. You have no idea, Zorian sighed. Thankfully. Kaczynski wasn't that rare of a last name and no one had accused him of lying when he denied any connections. Whatever Lukav had been trying to say next was promptly drowned out by the unmistakable sounds of explosions coming from the house in front of them. Immediately followed by angry shouting in an unknown language and sounds of gunshots. Zorian quickly drew his spell rod and scowled. He had been afraid of this. Whoever was behind the disappearance of the soul mages had noticed their assassination of Lukav had failed and decided to throw subtlety out of the window and move fast to eliminate their remaining target. They no doubt knew that Lukav and Alanik were friends and that Alanik would soon know all about the assassination attempt. He cautiously advanced forward. Lukav trailing after him. There were no undead this time. Probably because the target was a well-known undead hunter and was thus bound to be good against them. Instead, the attackers consisted of 15 men armed with rifles, probably non-magical mercenaries, and 2 mages acting like spell support. They were hesitant to simply storm Alanik's house. For some reason. And instead waited outside for something to happen. Unwilling to charge into a group of riflemen like idiots. Both Zorian and Lukav settled in behind some trees to observe the group. They're trying to bring down the wards before they move in, Zorian realized after a few seconds. The mage on the right is trying to collapse the entire warding scheme. The one on the left is protecting him from all reprisals while he's busy, and the riflemen are periodically shooting at the windows to keep Alanik from raining down offensive spells on them at will. A ray of fire punctuated his whispered statement by erupting from one of the second-story windows. Aiming for the mage who was dismantling the wards. The other mage immediately shielded his companion from the attack. And the rifleman responded with a withering barrage of bullets at the offending opening. We have to help him, Lukav said firmly. The only option I see is waiting for a good opening, Zorian said. I don't see a way to get involved right now that wouldn't immediately get us both killed. Can you deal with the 2 mages if I take care of the gun-toting idiots? Lukav asked. Zorian gave him a curious look. How did he intend to do that? Was he one of those idiots that still underestimated the effectiveness of guns even after the huge death toll they racked up against combat mages in the Splinter Wars? Well? Lukav asked. A little more harshly. Deciding to take some risk. Zorian skimmed the man's surface thoughts for a moment. He promptly realized that the man beside him cared deeply about Alanik and couldn't bear to see him killed if he could do something. Anything about it. He was ready to move in with or without Zorian. But he honestly thought he could prevail against the riflemen. He was far less sure whether he could survive against them if he had to deal with the mage support as well. Though. I can deal with them. Yeah, said Zorian. Wait for 2 minutes before you charge in. He then promptly cast invisibility on himself and walked off in the direction of the 2 mages. He wasn't walking for the sake of being dramatic. The invisibility spell he was using was a very delicate optical illusion that required his conscious attention to maintain. Any sort of distracting activity, such as fighting or casting spells, immediately unraveled it. He couldn't even run without turning into a shimmering humanoid outline that was far more attention-grabbing than simply walking up to the mages with no cloaking attempts. But a fast walk turned out to be sufficient. He was practically on top of the two mages when Lukav finally grew sick of waiting and charged into the fray with a battle cry. At least he thought the creature that came charging in was Lukav. The huge bull covered in dark green, fish-like scales, its eyes glowing with malevolent red light. Seemed like something a transformation expert would use, and it sure as hell wasn't aligned with the attackers. The beast let loose a loud bellow that was laced with some kind of magical fear effect. Zorian ignored the mental attack easily enough. But 3 of the riflemen weren't as fearless and immediately fled screaming. The rest were shaken enough by the fear effect that they gave the bull a few crucial moments to close in before they started firing. As Zorian expected, those scales weren't just for show. And the bullets didn't do much. The 2 hostile mages beside him seemed to realize their forces weren't going to fare well against this new threat because the defender suddenly started to cast a spell and the ward breaker sped up his work. Deciding that the defender was the bigger threat, Zorian decided to forego any fancy spellwork and simply pulled out a knife from his belt and rammed it harshly into the man's neck, dropping his own invisibility in the process. The other mage didn't react fast enough, too shocked at Zorian's sudden appearance, and received a swift kick in the groin a moment later. He immediately collapsed on the ground with a keening wail. After checking to see if any of the riflemen were gunning for him, they weren't. As they were too busy being trampled by the bull beast that Lukav had transformed into, Zorian reached into the mage's mind and blasted it with a crude telepathic assault. The man went unconscious like Zorian had been hoping he would. Out of the fight. Before Zorian could decide whether he should get involved in the fight against the rifleman, it seemed unnecessary. And he wasn't largely immune to gunfire like Lukav was. A trio of flaming projectiles rained down from the second floor and incinerated 3 of the riflemen that had been trying to rally the others. The bull beast let loose another fear-laced bellow at this, and the survivors promptly fled. Zorian watched them go, ready to erect a shield around himself if one of them decided to let loose a few parting shots. None of them did. The bull beast let out a derisive snort and kicked the ground a few times before suddenly folding upon itself, for the lack of a better word, and becoming a man. Specifically, Lukav. Man. Transformation was more useful than he had figured it was. He understood why Lukav had been reluctant to engage the attackers without someone to take out the mages, though without hands. The alchemist could not cast any defensive spells himself, and was very vulnerable to hostile magic. Any conversation was postponed when a short, bald, muscular man literally dropped out of the sky in front of them. It took Zorian almost a second to realize that this was probably Alanik Zosk and that he had jumped down from the freaking 2-story window. He looked unaffected by the fall. But still. Ow. You idiot. I told you not to do that shit. Lukav yelled. I almost firebombed you before I realized it was you. You. Boy, Alanik said to Zorian, completely ignoring Lukav's anger. Why did you let those men go? You could have picked them off as they fled. I didn't think it was okay to kill fleeing opponents. Zorian said, surprised at being put on the spot like that. I don't know. It just seemed too bloodthirsty to just shoot them in the back while they ran. A short silence ensued as Alanik gave him a blank look. His mind, though unshielded, was incredibly disciplined and gave Zorian no insight to the man's personality and mood. He idly noted that one of the man's eyes was blue, while the other one was brown. There was a horrid vertical scar over his blue eye, which really looked like it should have destroyed it as well when it was made. I see, he said finally. You're young. What has that got to do with anything? Zorian protested, annoyed at the man's attitude. They just saved the man's life. For God's sake. You haven't been fighting for long, he simply said. You're inexperienced. Yeah. Well. You're an asshole, thought Zorian. But outwardly he just frowned instead. Yeah. Zorian could already see Alanik would be one of those people. He really had the damnedest luck. In the meantime, he wanted to know what Zorian and Lukav came to him for. No. He didn't need time to calm down. Why do you ask? Zorian had to admit he admired the man's composure. Even if he was a rude ass. Interesting, Alanik said after Zorian repeated the story he told Lukav. Very well. I will see what has been done to you. Lukav. Please leave the room while I examine Mr. Kaczynski here. Just like that? Apparently yes. Unlike Lukav. Alanik didn't use any fancy ritual rooms. And the examination took all of 5 minutes before the man had pronounced his verdict. You have a marker stamped into your soul, Alanik told him bluntly. A what? Zorian asked. A marker is a combination of a beacon and an identification tag. It allows certain spells to find the marker very easily across great distances and unambiguously identifies whatever is tagged by the marker. They are often used by shopkeepers in fancier shops to track stolen wares. By high-security prisons and spies to track movements of marked individuals and in construction of certain wards that allow people to be keyed in and therefore free of some or all of the restrictions that all other visitors labor under. Among other things. They are usually placed on items. As placing permanent markers on people is iffy and requires tattoos and such. Yours though, is stamped directly into your soul. Zorian remained quiet. His thoughts churning. A marker. That was why he ended up caught in the time loop along with Zack. Wasn't it? The spell wasn't keyed into the originator's soul or some such. Since those things were ambiguous and could fail, the original looper could end up with his soul damaged or slightly altered. Much like what happened to him and Zack in the end. And then the spell could glitch and fail to loop them back like it's supposed to. No. The makers of the loop instead stamped Zack's soul with something unchangeable and unmistakable. And then Red Robe and Zorian inherited it. Because the makers of the loop were a little too smart for their own good. Removing the marker, Alanik began. Oblivious or uncaring about Zorian's obvious state of deep thought. I don't want it removed. Zorian immediately protested. Broken out of his thoughts. Alanik gave him a considering look. I suppose you are fortunate then. Because I do not think I could remove it even if I wanted to, Alanik said. It is unlike anything I have ever seen. The marker is woven incredibly tightly into your soul. Suffusing every corner of it. It is as if a chunk of your soul was replaced with it and it then grew to fill every nook and cranny it could find to root itself in as firmly as possible. Oh hell. He rose from his seat in agitation. Pacing around the room. Alanik watched him impassively. Silent and expressionless. Until Zorian calmed down a little and sat back down. I need more information, he said. And I need a way to protect myself from things like this in the future. Can you help me? Alanik nodded. But tomorrow, he added. For now I have a prisoner to interrogate. Despite Alanik's proclamation that he was going to interrogate the prisoner, he did not immediately descend into the temple dungeon. Instead he started rummaging through a nearby cabinet full of potion bottles while Zorian slowly absorbed today's newest revelations. Opting to remain in the room for the moment. He was not in the mood for answering questions that Lukav would have for him once he got outside. And Alanik seemed like the sort of person who would warn him if he was being bothersome. Since Alanik said nothing about his continued presence, Zorian felt he had tacit permission to stay. He had a piece of propagating, self-repairing magic lodged in his soul. Part of him marveled at the magical expertise of the person or thing that created the time loop system. But the greater part of him couldn't help but wonder what exactly was crammed into said wonder of magical spell design. Alanik's description. as well as Lukav's inability to identify the spell despite his advanced-looking ritual, painted a picture of something far too complex and lifelike to be a mere identification tag. This was important. He could feel it. He needed to know how the marker functioned as soon as possible. For one thing, if there was some kind of hostile contingency woven inside it, ready to screw him over once he tripped over some esoteric activation condition, he wanted to know about it. Not to mention that this particular piece of magic could very well be a key clue to understanding the time loop. What kind of secrets were locked inside of it? Kale had speculated that whatever spell had been placed on Zack to initiate the time loop had all sorts of safeguards and contingencies woven into it. And while the marker clearly wasn't the source of the looping magic itself, it sounded like the perfect place to put those safeguards in. Maybe it had the time loop instructions manual encoded somewhere in its structure. Well, probably nothing so convenient. But still, there was one thing that still bothered him greatly. If he had a marker in his soul that uniquely identified him as a time looper, why the hell hadn't Red Robe tracked him down by now? His enemy was a proficient soul mage. After all, Zorian found it difficult to believe he was ignorant of the marker mechanism. With that in mind, he should have had little trouble locating every single time looper, Zorian included. But he didn't. Why was that? Mr. Zosk. Zorian spoke up. Could you spare a moment? Please. Call me Alanik, the priest said, stopping his inspection of the cabinet with an annoyed huff. Zorian got the impression the annoyance was directed more at the cabinet than at Zorian. Though. What is it? I know you said we'd speak tomorrow, but I'd just like to know how difficult it is to locate a marker like mine. How hard would it be for you to track me down with the best magic at your disposal? By tracking your marker. Almost impossible, Alanik immediately stated. I'd need the original keystone from the maker of the spell to define the search criteria properly. That thing is far too complex for anything else. Zorian frowned. Wouldn't having my own copy of the marker sidestep that? He asked. Well, yes. But that would require you to be right beside me and serve as a willing focus of the spell. A tracking spell that requires you to be right next to the target is functionally useless. Wouldn't you think? He suddenly gave Zorian a shrewd look. But what you're really wondering about is not you tracking down the person whose soul fragment gave you the marker, but them tracking you. Aren't you? Mr. Kaczynski. Call me Zorian, he said. If the man wanted Zorian to be casual with him, he should show the same courtesy. And yes, that is basically what I'm worried about. How easy would it be for another holder of the marker to track me down? Alanik quickly walked over to a nearby bookshelf, plucked a plain brown book from its shelf and handed it to Zorian. The spell you want is on page 43, Alanik told him. Zorian quickly leafed through the book until he reached the indicated page. The spell in question was not an invocation, but rather a 10-minute ritual. It allowed the caster to locate a specified marker based on the copy of the marker in the caster's possession. And it had a downright jaw-dropping range. If Zorian was reading this correctly, it could locate any and all copies of the marker over a circular area that extended well beyond Eldamar's borders. Yeah. It was not cheap in terms of mana use. It required enough mana that Zorian wouldn't have been able to cast it at all before the time loop. And even now, after 3 years of restarts, it would take a sizable chunk of his reserves. But still, for a nationwide search spell it was shockingly accessible. He supposed its very narrow search focus allowed it to be hyper-efficient about mana use. Really, the only possible deal-breaker was that the spell assumed the caster had a keystone imprinted with the copy of the marker, and would have to be slightly modified to switch the reference target of the spell from a stone held in the caster's hand to a marker stamped on their soul. Zorian sincerely doubted Red Robe was incapable of making such minor alterations to spells. Though I could be tracked from one end of the country to another, Zorian mumbled disbelievingly to himself. Yes, Alanik agreed. Possibly even further. I don't claim to have comprehensive knowledge of tracking spells, so there may be a version with even greater range. Your insistence that the marker must stay on was quite surprising. I hope you have a good reason for leaving a giant target painted on your soul. Ugh. I'm not happy about the situation. But I do. I really do. I'd also like to cast this tracking spell myself to see how many other people turn up in results. But we can deal with that tomorrow. I've already kept you from your interrogation long enough. Unfortunately, I seem to have run out of truth potions, the priest said unhappily, throwing a glare at his potion cabinet. Annoying. You can't buy those on the open market, and it takes days for Lukav to make a batch. It seems I won't be interrogating anyone today. Oh. He agreed with Alanik. That really was annoying. He wanted to know who the guy was working for just as much as the priest did. He thought about offering his services as a mind reader to the priest, but quickly shelved that idea. Aside from the very likely possibility he would make Alanik too suspicious of Zorian to help him with his soul magic problems, there was the fact that he wasn't sure how much help he would be anyway. His mind-reading skills were still very unreliable at this point. He'd feel pretty stupid if he outed himself as a mind mage and then failed to achieve anything of note. Better try that in some later restart. After he gave his telepathic abilities some polish. No matter. I will figure something out. I'm afraid I'll have to postpone our meeting for a day or two because of this. Though. I'll send a message through Lukav once I have sorted my business in order. Agreeable? Sure, Zorian shrugged. Just don't die before we meet again. Whoever wants you and Lukav dead can clearly throw a lot of resources at the problem, so they're unlikely to stop now. The same goes for you. Young man, Alanik scoffed. You seem to have an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Suspicious. That. If I were in the attacker's place, I would definitely make sure to get rid of you before trying again. And no offense. But you look like a much softer target than me. Not having much to say to that, Zorian simply bid the man goodbye. Had a brief conversation with Lukav outside the room to inform him of everything, and then went back to his room at the inn. He would sleep on things before making any decisions. With the next several days freed up for his own activities, Zorian decided to go visit Silver Lake and see if the capricious old witch was in a better mood to help this time. The trouble was, he could no longer find her cottage. His memory was extremely good, and he remembered exactly where it was in relation to surrounding natural landmarks. But when he physically got to the location, there was nothing there. No cottage. No witch. No nothing. As far as Zorian could tell, it wasn't an illusion, and there was no ward in place messing with his mind to stop him from noticing it. He detected no mental tampering. His area-wide dispels revealed no optical flickering. And he physically passed through the area that the cottage stood on in the previous restart and met no resistance whatsoever. Whatever the exact mechanics, he clearly wasn't going to reach Silver Lake's place without her inviting him first. Considering that last time it took him several days of wandering around and almost dying to get her attention, he decided to not bother with that and find something else to do. Namely, investigating the rest of the disappeared soul mages. While it was true that Alanik seemed to be his best clue at the moment, it wouldn't hurt to check the other locations as well. Thus, while waiting for Alanik to contact him again, Zorian proceeded to break into the homes of each of his targets before combing through them with every divination spell in his arsenal. The knowledge he picked up from Guri's little escapade was quite useful here, as a number of those homes were warded against entry and divinations. And that would have given him quite a bit of trouble in the past. What he found out wasn't much. But it did put at least one question to rest: the attackers had indeed been active long before the time loop started. 2 of the houses showed signs of a struggle. And forensic spells dated those signs about a month to a month and a half before the start of the time loop. In addition, the house of the old curse-breaking herbalist lady looked pristine on first glance. But Zorian easily detected evidence of repair magic used on furniture and sloppily erased blood splatter on the walls, both dated 3 days before the start of the loop. Zorian silently thanked Hazlush for his divination instructions. Without them, he would have never been able to tell such things with any degree of certainty. He also made sure to search the houses for anything personally interesting while he was at it. And here he had greater success. The herbalist lady had intact notes about her curse-breaking side business. Zorian pocketed those, even if he wasn't able to make use of them at the moment. She also had a pretty extensive journal that listed where to find rare plants in the nearby forest, as well as detailed some of her rare recipes. Zorian left that alone for now, but made a mental note to show it to Kale at some point and see if it was worth something. The ransacked tower turned out to have been imperfectly ransacked. And Zorian managed to find 2 different secret compartments that the attackers missed. One held a trio of high-quality combat staffs and a stack of blasting rods. The other held a bunch of spellbooks containing combat spells specifically. The sort of combat spells you couldn't buy legally anywhere because they were far too effective and lethal for the Mage Guild's tastes. Naturally, Zorian swiped all of it for his personal use. He found more interesting stuff in other houses, but nothing he felt like taking at the moment. The familiar obsessed guy, for instance, had mountains and mountains of books and journals dedicated to soul bonds, magical creatures, and familiar-related magics. It was interesting, but not something he needed at the moment. In the end, it was 5 days before Alanik finally contacted Zorian again. If Lukav didn't insist that his friend was alive and well, just unusually occupied with something, Zorian would have feared the attackers got him. Regardless, Zorian soon found himself seated in front of Alanik, ready to finally discuss things. "I apologize for the wait," Alanik said. "I'm afraid that the confessions I managed to force out of the prisoner had far more far-reaching consequences than I had initially suspected." "Oh. I don't suppose you could tell me what those are?" asked Zorian. "I'm afraid not. It's not something you should concern yourself with," Alanik said, leveling him a mild glare. "Fine. Fine. I get it," Zorian said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Truthfully, it did not matter much because he already knew what Alanik had found out. While the priest seemed to have some sort of natural mental defense, his friend Lukav didn't. Zorian had simply pestered the transformation expert about the prisoner and read the man's thoughts wherever he refused to answer. Basically, the mage Zorian incapacitated was hired by none other than Vazen, the man who Guri wanted him to rob, well, spy on, in the previous restart. Worse, the man appeared to be just an underling himself, with the real ringleader being someone more highly placed in the local hierarchy. Someone capable of interfering with the police and guild investigations. It was certainly an interesting piece of information. And Zorian had some suspicions of his own about Vazen now. The man had concluded some kind of deal with a company in Scioria. So it was entirely possible he was connected to the invaders somehow. He had intended to have another go at those documents anyway. But now they acquired a whole new importance. "Good," Alanik nodded. "What did you want to start with?" "Well, first of all, I'd like to know if you could help me defend myself against soul magic in the future," said Zorian. "I was told that spellcasters without some measure of soul perception can only cast the most rudimentary of soul magic," said Zorian. "And from his attempts to duplicate Kale's spells, He knew that to be largely true, the only spell he managed to learn from Kale was the one that cloaked him from the soul perception of other necromancers. And Kale claimed that was baby stuff. Ah. You've been talking to a necromancer. I see, Alanik said. Zorian winced. It seemed like a logical course of action. I had a soul magic problem. And he was a soul mage. Humph. Necromancers, began Alanik, taking pains to stress the word, have a habit of targeting others with their spells. So of course they consider soul perception to be absolutely essential for their craft. If you just want to cloak your soul in some protective effect, it is hardly necessary to go to such lengths. Oh. Is that why he could cast Kale's soul sight invisibility spell but not the rest of his arsenal? Even for other things. It is possible to use lengthy rituals to get around that requirement. I believe you've already experienced an example of such a ritual when Lukav tried to determine what is wrong with you. Don't be fooled by his lack of skill. Lukav is but a dabbler in this branch of magic. And if you dedicate yourself to the discipline, you could end up much more impressive than he is. But I'm never going to progress beyond unwieldy ritual setups without soul sight. Am I? Guessed Zorian. Alanik sighed. Yes. But soul sight is too much of a temptation. It makes soul magic too easy. For the sake of your immortal soul, I implore you to turn away from that path. It is not necessary to go that far just to protect yourself. I see, said Zorian. Out of curiosity. Do you have soul perception? For the first time since Zorian met him, Alanik looked uncomfortable. Yes. But that's different. Of course it is, Zorian thought. Do as I say. Not as I do. Just like it always was. But he didn't say that. Instead he asked Alanik what exactly he was willing to teach him. There are two ways I can see this going, said Alanik, quickly regaining his composure. Option 1 is that I teach you how to perform a plethora of protective rituals to foil hostile soul magic. They are, as you say, cumbersome. Casting times can be up to 2 hours long in some cases. And setting up a ritual isn't easy. They last a long time. Though. Weeks if you perform them correctly. The advantage of this path is that you get a way to defend yourself right away. I'm fairly certain you could do the beginning rituals as you are now. Also, some of the rituals will allow you to affect souls other than yours. Though none of the rituals I'm willing to teach you can be used on an unwilling target. And the disadvantage is that if I'm ever caught unaware by the enemy, I'm screwed because there's no way to shield myself on a moment's notice, finished Zorian. Exactly. That's where option number 2 comes in. With the help of some meditation exercises and special potions, I can teach you how to feel your own soul. If you hone the skill to a required level, this skill will allow you to cast any soul magic that has you as its target. You'll be able to shield and analyze your soul with invocation spells. And it might even allow you to passively notice when someone is messing with your soul in some fashion. I like that option, Zorian said. I figured you might, Alanik scoffed. The problem is that this option isn't some quick power-up. It will take you months to reach usable levels in this skill. And that's assuming you have the patience and willpower required to perform the exercises every single day for months on end. I do, said Zorian curtly. We'll see. I should also mention that until you master the skill of sensing your own soul, this option will leave you just as helpless to soul magic as you are currently. Yeah. That's a little dangerous, Zorian admitted. Still, the second option sounded way more useful and functional than the first one. Maybe if he wasn't stuck in the time loop he would blanch at the idea of spending months of his life like that. But right now it was looking like a bargain. I suppose there is a reason why I can't learn both at the same time. They're both demanding skills in their own way. And I don't trust you to be capable of juggling them both effectively, Alanik said. His tone brooking no disagreement. Fair enough, Zorian said. He was going to visit the man in future restarts anyway. So he could potentially just pick different options on different restarts. How about this, you teach me the very basics of the soul rituals. The things I can pick up well enough as I am now. And then we immediately switch to the personal soul awareness project. I suppose I can live with that. You should note that the basics of soul rituals won't do much for you, Alanik noted. That's fine. I'm mostly interested in option number 2 anyway. The reason I want the basics of soul rituals is because I still want to cast that marker tracking ritual you showed me. And modifying it to work with the thing attached to my soul is probably going to require some working knowledge of soul magic. Probably, Alanik agreed. Well. Now we come to the make it or break it question, Zorian sighed. Fixing a weary gaze at Alanik. What exactly are you asking of me in exchange for all this? Alanik rolled his eyes. Don't be so dramatic. Boy. Teaching people how to defend themselves against necromancers and hostile spirits is a part of my calling. As far as I'm concerned. I'd take a whole class to teach if people were actually interested. Unfortunately. Such threats are considered something of a minor issue in the aftermath of the Necromancer's War. So while yes, I do intend to send you on an errand or two, it isn't going to be anything too onerous. Lukav tells me you can teleport. I can. Yes. Excellent. I was thinking of sending you out as a courier from time to some of my more distant contacts. Nothing difficult or dangerous, just delivering some letters and packages for free. Half an hour later. Zorian had managed to hammer out some kind of agreement with Alanik. Overall, Zorian felt the priest had been quite generous in his terms. His principal demand was that Zorian had to show dedication. Or else Alanik would unceremoniously terminate the lessons and kick him out. Specifically, he had to show up at the temple every evening like clockwork. And show diligence and enthusiasm for the lessons. Right. Oh. And there was the whole business with him being a courier from the priest on occasion. Which was of little concern to Zorian. He thought of it as teleportation practice more than anything. Well then, Alanik said. Leaning back in his chair. Now that this is all done, we can begin with our first lesson. What? Now? Zorian asked in surprise. Is there a reason to postpone things? No. No. I'm just surprised. Most of my previous teachers have been well. No matter. What are we starting with? Over the next 2 weeks Zorian continued studying the other disappearances while attending Alanik's lessons. He absorbed the basics of soul protection rituals in a few days and then moved on to the meditation exercises needed for personal soul sight. Only to find out 2 things. First, the meditation exercises were incredibly, mind-numbingly boring. No wonder the man was worried about Zorian's dedication. He could easily imagine someone dropping that after only a few days. But no. Zorian was stronger than that, and besides, he really needed that skill. Secondly, those special potions Alanik mentioned. What the priest hadn't clarified at the time, and indeed hadn't explained before Zorian actually drank one, was that they were extremely powerful hallucinogens. Almost immediately after downing one, Zorian was assaulted with a cacophony of strange, incomprehensible sights and smells. Sounds become distorted and unrecognizable. And his thoughts degenerated into a chaotic mess. It was a profoundly unpleasant experience. And once Zorian finally came to his senses and stopped drooling all over the floor of the temple, the jerk could have at least put a pillow under him. He felt a powerful desire to punch Alanik in the face. The man had effectively drugged him helpless and was completely unrepentant about it too. claiming that without the help of those potions the entire process could take years. He would have to drink one of those once a week. Apparently. Which was all well and good. But it still didn't explain why the man hadn't warned him what would happen when he drank that potion. Personally, Zorian suspected Schadenfreude. Aside from the whole potion incident thing, there was one tiny little detail he had failed to consider when he decided to accept Alanik as his newest personal tutor. Alanik was a priest. Priests were, generally speaking, very religious people. It stood to reason, then, that they'd be very bothered by people who don't care much about their own religion or have some gaping holes in their understanding of religious dogma. And with Zorian spending every evening in the temple, it really was too much to expect that Alanik wouldn't notice just how lacking Zorian's religious credentials were. The good news was that Alanik wasn't going to get rid of him because of this. The bad news was that he took it upon himself to correct this glaring deficiency. Thus, not only did Zorian have to suffer through boring meditation sessions every evening, they were now interspersed with long-winded lectures about the gods, angels, spirits, and man's place in the natural order. Heaven help him. Or not. He supposed. He doubted the angels would have a lot of compassion for someone in his position. And thus, with the evidence that the gods have fallen silent no longer possible to ignore, and the unescapable fact that no more miracles would be forthcoming, the Holy Triumvirate decided to loosen the limitations on soul magic, a decision that did much to soften the blow of the silence, but one that would have far-reaching negative consequences. But I can see that you are starting to lose focus, so we will continue this tomorrow. Thank the gods. Zorian quickly vacated the temple before the man could have a chance to change his mind. He was barely out of the temple gates when he realized he was walking into an ambush. It was a crow that tipped him off. It looked normal enough, though it was curiously brave in not fleeing at his approach. He had, however, gotten into a habit of automatically scanning the minds of every animal he saw as telepathic practice. And the crow in question didn't have any. That immediately raised an alarm in his head, and he stopped, expanding his mind sense to maximum range. In the next second he threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets that ripped through his previous location. Almost reflexively, he fired 2 force missiles in quick succession, one at the undead crow that had taken flight while he dodged. He didn't need that thing pecking his eyes out while he was busy elsewhere, and another one straight into the air, seemingly at nothing. That one was what Taven called a screamer, a missile that produced a loud, shrill scream as it flew through the air. Zorian hoped that the noise would give pause to the ambushers, at least for a moment. But the real purpose of it was to attract Alanik's attention and tell him there was a fight going on outside of his temple. You know, just in case the gunshots weren't clear enough on that. The first bolt collided with the crow, causing it to erupt into a shower of feathers and fleshy bits, but no blood. But the second one didn't have much effect on the attackers. Zorian was forced to immediately erect a shield in front of himself to tank a powerful beam of shining force, and was then pinned in place by a withering hail of bullets. He had to pour half of his mana reserves into strengthening the shield, but it thankfully held. Also thankfully, the attackers had a piss-poor sense of tactics. Apparently the entire force wasted their ammo on the initial barrage, and thus couldn't provide any further fire to keep him pinned in place while they reloaded. Zorian promptly took advantage of this to take cover behind a nearby tree, become invisible, and then vacate the area as fast as he could without breaking the optical cloak. It was a good thing he did, because the tree he had been hiding behind soon became a target of a massive fireball that reduced it to charcoal and did horrible things to everything around it. These people really didn't pull any punches, did they? Tracking his attackers' movements with his mind sense, Zorian could tell they weren't fooled with his maneuver. They knew he wasn't dead. And they were coming after him. Welp. Time to exercise the better part of valor and teleport away to safety. A few seconds later. He sighed in resignation. Of course they erected a teleport ward around the area. Well. If that's how they wanted to play, then so be it. Closing his eyes. He located the nearest gunman with his mind sense. Connected with his mind and then hit him with the best telepathic attack he could manage. He felt the target stop immediately. But apparently he'd failed to knock the man out. No matter. He disconnected from the man's mind and moved on the next one and repeated the procedure. He grinned nastily when he felt the man's mind shut down from the strain. The gunman falling unconscious. Then he moved on to the rest of the ambushing force. Attacking their minds one by one. 2/3 of them were strong enough to weather the attack. Though they would likely be dazed for a while and suffer a nasty headache for the rest of the day. But a full third found Zorian's telepathic attack too much for them. Sadly. The mage that supported them figured out what was happening and shielded his own mind against the tactic. Still. Even if he didn't get them all. He succeeded in taking away their momentum and slowing them down. It cost him. Though. His telepathic powers. Exotic as they may be. Were still magic, and like all magic. They used mana to power themselves. His empathy and mind sense didn't seem to cost him anything that he could detect. And establishing a telepathic link with another was trivial in terms of mana expenditure even for him. It was so minute as to be unnoticeable. But these telepathic attacks he had been doing. They were incredibly cheap. Especially considering their effectiveness. But he had performed a lot of them in quick succession. He was almost spent. He sure hoped Alanik got off his ass sometime soon. Preferably before the mage could rally his forces and come after him again. Suddenly. Just as Zorian was about to start booby-trapping the place like crazy. Another group of people teleported in and his heart sank. Well, that just wasn't F-wait. They were fighting the first group. It seemed Alanik had called for the cavalry. The sound of gunshots and flashes of spellfire filled the air again. But this time Zorian wasn't the target. Zorian wisely decided to sit this one out. Being mostly out of mana and not wanting for one of the newcomers to confuse him for an enemy and put a bullet in his head before he had a chance to explain. 10 minutes later. The noise quieted down and Zorian made his way back to the temple. There he found Alanik talking with a mixed group composed of a foreman group of guild battle mages and a small contingent of Eldamar soldiers. He was questioned on his role in the battle. But the fact that Alanik vouched for him kept the man in charge of the group from dragging him back to the guild station for questioning. Apparently Alanik had quite a lot of pull with the mage guild. He was worried the attackers would blab about Zorian's telepathic abilities. But apparently they were under the impression Zorian cast some kind of area-wide knockout spell rather than assaulting their minds directly. The leader of the guild force even commended him on his restraint when faced with deadly force. Alanik gave him a severe look though. Zorian wasn't sure if he did that because he figured out there was something fishy about the whole story or because he disapproved of Zorian's soft approach. He knew from previous conversations with the man that Alanik firmly believed in tough justice and striking back at threats as effectively as possible. So he might just be annoyed that Zorian had not used something more lethal. Eventually he was given permission to leave, though warned not to leave his current accommodations in Nyazov Dveri for the foreseeable future, and beat a hasty retreat back to his room. When Zorian reached his room, he felt totally drained and wanted to do nothing more than to crawl into his bed and sleep until tomorrow. That had been intense. He thought he'd have gotten used to having his life targeted and being in life-and-death situations. But he apparently wasn't anywhere near that mindset yet. The questioning that followed wasn't really pleasant either. And he suspected he had overextended his mind a bit with his last stunt because his thoughts felt slightly more sluggish and fuzzy than they should. even taking his tiredness into account. But no. He couldn't go to sleep yet. Today was significant in that he had finally finished modifying the marker tracking spell with Alanic's help. And he wanted to test it right away. His mana reserves had recovered by now. So he was good for a try. He quickly fished out one of the wakefulness potions he had made over the last week and downed it in one go. His head cleared out almost immediately. And so he promptly started creating the ritual circle with the handful of salt and powdered quartz. After the circle was made and triple-checked for faults, he slowly went through the ritual, mindful not to mess it up since it would take a large chunk of his mana reserves whether it succeeded or failed. The moment he spoke the last line of the ritual, Zorian was suddenly given a sense of the location and distance of all markers within the range of the spell. All two of them. One was in the very center of the search area that was him, obviously, and the other was far to the south, somewhere along Eldamar's southern border. Zorian freely admitted he had not expected that. He had expected the ritual to locate either 3 markers or just one, himself. How can there be just 2? Was one of the other time travelers out of range? Did he misunderstand something? He would have to repeat the ritual at different intervals to see if another marker popped up at some point. On the very beginning of the next restart. Certainly. But if the number of markers remained stubbornly at 2, then that would mean that at least one of the time travelers didn't have the marker. Probably Red Robe. Because Zorian was sure that Zack had one. It would explain why Red Robe didn't just make a beeline for Zorian when he realized he existed. And why he felt the need to ask Zorian how many other time travelers there were and who they were. But that would mean that Red Robe became a time looper through some other mechanism than Zorian did. Wouldn't it? Nothing can ever be simple about this. Can it? He sighed, rubbing his eyes. No matter. His immediate goals remained unchanged by this new complication: learn how to protect his soul, become a better fighter, and polish his mind magic into something usable and reliable. His mind drifted to the battle he was caught in today and he nodded to himself. His performance wasn't flawless, but he got out of it alive and the growth of his skills was undeniable. Despite all the issues he encountered, he seemed well on his way to achieving his goals.